Master manipulators, planetary conquerors, soul devourers, nightmare lords, dragon tyrants, steel-making demons. Welcome to the dark corners of Dreamworks. Today we're ranking every single Dreamworks Animation villain from evil to most evil. Starting as we usually do with the latter category, let's begin with the villains who canonically learned their lesson and changed for the better. These are the reformed villains. At the bottom of our list, we have a classic example of the monster to pet pipeline, Chunky from the Croods. Chunky starts as the most dangerous of many creatures who attack the main ensemble cast. He's not averse to attacking people while they're down and doesn't always take pursuit of his prey seriously. That is, until he's forced to. Next, we have one half of the villainous duo from Trolls band together, Veneer. From an objective standpoint, Veneer is just as guilty as his sister of their mutual crimes. He contributed to kidnapping, torture, and fraud on a pretty major scale. So why isn't he any higher? Well, to put it simply, he actually has a moral compass, which separates him pretty bluntly from his sister. It's plain to see that Veneer is manipulated by Velvet to do what he does. Probably the most blatant example of this was the scene where Floyd tried to appeal to his morals to convince Veneer to let him go.
Just because she's your sister doesn't mean you should let her treat you like garbage.
Doesn't it?
Only for Velvet to coincidentally decide to be nice and encouraging to her brother for the first time in the movie. Wow, what a nice and sincere turnaround for her character. Psych, she keeps verbally abusing him after this. Veneer is the one who exposes his and Velvet's misdeeds during a performance, which must have taken some serious guts. And he even accepts his prison sentence with a smile on his face, happy to get the chance to atone for his crimes.
Fair enough. Prison it is!
Hopefully Floyd will be nice enough to visit him in prison, though I won't blame him too much if he doesn't. Up next is the literal loan shark Don Lino. Sharktail has one of the less sympathetic protagonists in DreamWorks' roster, so it's fitting that its villain is one of the least evil of the bunch.
Do you know who I am? I'm the Don. The boss.
To the Don's credit, he does genuinely love his family, generally treating them and other allies with kindness, emphasis on generally. Unfortunately, most of the credit he'd get for this is immediately taken away by his ruthless methods. He's willing to literally torture his debtors if they can't pay their dues, and it doesn't accept Lenny's choice to be a vegetarian, insisting that he has to eat smaller, more defenseless creatures.
Right here in front of me now, eat this.
We can't really take points off of a shark for being a carnivore, but come on, man, that poor shrimp just wanted to live. In the end, he actually does find some redemption when Oscar talks some sense into him, which ultimately leads to Lino making amends with his son and making peace with the reef, even coming back to support the whale wash. Now, it's one thing to eat small, defenseless creatures, but helping others eat such creatures is even worse. Enter Creek from the original Trolls movie. Originally a friend to the village and Poppy's crush, Creek was a victim of circumstance. When the trolls were captured by the Bergens, Creek happened to be the unlucky soul chosen as Gristle's meal.
Oh, my first troll.
Somehow managing to bust out of his mouth, Creek comes up with the solution to sell out his friends in Troll Village in exchange for his life being spared. Honestly, I can at least somewhat sympathize with him doing this.
I'm doing this for you.
Being literally eaten alive would surely make someone desperate and unreasonable.
He's someone else, anyone else, everyone else, but not me!
But for him to try and frame his decision as a heroic sacrifice, since he's the one who would have to live with the guilt of it, it takes away from most of the sympathy we'd have for him. And that's not to mention the smug smile on his face when he led Chef to the Trolls' hideout. The only reason he isn't much higher on the list is the fact that he eventually returns in the Best Goes On series, where he apologizes for his actions and promises to do better if they're ever in that scenario again. How it only took 11 minutes for Poppy and the gang to forgive this guy is beyond me, but I mean, good for him if he has changed.
Why don't you try some positivity, eh? A little positivity might go with that best.
It's gonna take more than a couple apology videos for anyone to trust this guy again, though. Better bust out that ukulele, Creek. Another Trolls villain, Queen Barb, is up next. If you've ever come into contact with a musical elitist, someone who just straight up refuses to acknowledge any music they don't personally enjoy, then Queen Barb will probably strike a chord with you. Barb's plan was simple, but brutal. She wanted to unite all of Trollkind under the genre of rock and roll, destroying all other genres of music and their respective cultures with extreme prejudice.
I can make us all one nation of trolls under rock.
Yeah, what could go wrong with attempting to streamline every human troll being into a singular genre and culture? As severely screwed up as Barb's motives were, she did ultimately show remorse for her actions and even managed to become friends with Poppy after the fact. It's maybe one of the less satisfying redemptions, but it's a redemption nonetheless. Perhaps a more impressive one is that of Humpty Alexander Dumpty from the first Puss in Boots movie. A childhood friend of Puss's, Humpty cherished his bond with fellow fairytale freak Puss in Boots more than anything else. So when Puss became a hero, and in Humpty's twisted point of view, abandoned him, let's just say it wasn't over easy easy for him. When Puss decided to give up his life of crime, old Huevo here decided to get him roped into a large-scale bank robbery under false pretenses, ruining his reputation and having him driven out of town.
This is the money of the people.
On top of all that, he had the audacity to be mad at Puss for leaving him behind to face the consequences of his own actions.
Save me.
Save yourself.
And on top of that, he later betrays Puss again. He's saved from a higher, more evil spot only through his final moments, in which he helps Puss save the town from the Great Terror, sacrificing his life so Puss would be able to pull the golden goose up.
Puss, you have to save the baby or the mama will destroy San Ricardo.
And wouldn't you know it, he had a heart of gold all this time. This is a man's corpse. Rounding out this category is perhaps the least direct redemption of a Dreamworks villain, Captain Smek. His deeds definitely aren't nearly as heinous as Barb's nor Humpty's, but he makes up for that with his ego and his sheer pettiness. Smek is a control freak who insists on constantly running away from his problems, and while protecting his people is understandable, it's also worth noting that Smek's theft of a rock from the Gorg is the exact reason their arch enemies are constantly chasing after them. On top of being a coward, Smek is a jerk.
I will not abandon it! Someone fetch me my stress blankie!
Using his position as leader and his precious rock to shut people up.
Shush her.
Josh!
In the end, it turns out that the rock was actually an egg containing larvae of the Gorg, meaning that Smek was unknowingly carrying unborn children with him and running away from their panicked parents. Yeah, at that point, becoming a DJ on the moon is about the best you can hope for. Moving on, we now reach the characters who didn't really have direct redemption arcs, but the sympathetic antagonists are those who aren't exactly bad guys, per se. At the very least, they have understandable reasons for their actions. By far, the most pitiable of the bunch has to be Ken from the B-movie. Ken is, I guess, the antagonist of the B-movie. I mean, he isn't really in the movie that much, but when he is, his crimes include, getting kinda angry. He also tries to kill Barry, which, dude, that's a B.
That's funny, I just can't seem to recall that.
Not only does Ken have a right to take out any bugs that invade his apartment, but he's literally allergic to bee stings, and his girlfriend just does nothing but get onto him for being so heartless as to kill this poor, innocent Jerry Seinfeld insect.
What are you talking about? Are there other bugs in your life?
Seriously, man, Ken was done so dirty on so many levels. Imagine getting dumped because of a bee, having said bee seduce your girlfriend, and finding out that they open a law firm together, all in the span of one movie.
Oh, that bee is living my life!
Let it go, Kenny.
Next is another average Joe villain, but not voiced by Joe this time. Melvin from the Captain Underpants movie. Melvin is the stereotypical brainiac who's always snitching on other students to get that sweet, sweet extra credit.
Did you tattletale on us?
Maybe I did, maybe I didn't. I did.
We'd arguably place him higher for that if it weren't for Professor Poopy Pants' brain scan on him. It turns out that the haha guffaw chuckalalamus, aka the part of the brain that makes you experience laughter in this universe, is completely absent from Melvin's brain.
Exactly. You have no sense of humor like a chair or a supermodel.
This explains why, despite being the smartest kid in class, Melvin never understands what the kids around him are joking about. Melvin literally cannot find joy in normal kid stuff like pranks, cartoons, jokes, etc. He's just able to cling to any extra credit and external validation he can get. Honestly, I just feel bad for the poor guy. Nerd emoji embodiment aside, it must be tough to go through life without being able to laugh. Next is another guy with a tough life situation, Mr. Tweety. While he's by far the less problematic of Chicken Run's antagonists, Mr. Tweety isn't perfect by any means.
No chicken escapes from Tweedy's farm!
He treats the chickens on his farm roughly and contributes to the hostile environment his wife has created for them. Still, he's also very clearly abused by Mrs. Tweety, so you can't help but wonder if he really has a choice in the matter. Another guy who's rough with animals is the Verminator from Over the Hedge. While he takes an uncomfortable amount of pleasure in killing animals, even having a giant effigy of himself hammering a rabbit on top of his van, it's worth noting that he's, an exterminator.
Verminator is on the job.
That would keep him from even being on this list, but given that he's more than willing to make the animals suffer before they die if they take him off, he's still definitely earned a placement as a villain. The Madagascar native Vasa are a similar note. Rather than being exterminators, obviously, the Vasa are simply, well, carnivores. I guess you could interpret their actions as enjoyment of attacking and eating small creatures, but you could also interpret it as just them enjoying being alive. Still, as messed up as the Verminator is, he's at least providing a service to his community, whereas the Vasa are definitely just in it for themselves. It's understandable, sure, but you really have to split hairs on a list like this. Speaking of hairs that have split, next up is Mr. Crump. the principal of Jerome Horowitz Elementary. Whether you read the books or watch the movie, you know that Krupp is the embodiment of how basically every elementary school kid sees their principal.
I'm gonna get you two one day. One day. Very, very soon.
He's strict, he's boring, and he takes an unnatural amount of pleasure in tormenting children. So aside from him unknowingly being the alter ego of Captain Underpants, there isn't too much overtly good to say about him. That said, the movie actually does paint Krupp in a surprisingly sympathetic light. When George and Harold realize just how lonely and empty Krupp's life is, they start understanding him a bit more, even helping set him up on a date with the cafeteria lady as a well-intentioned prank. Without even knowing they did this, Krupp responds to this good fortune by returning the comic books he confiscated from them, even admitting they were at least a little funny. Something tells me that if you crack this egg-shaped bad guy open, just like Humpty, you'd find a heart of gold. Don't actually do that though, that's a homicide. An antagonist with less sympathetic traits is Gladys Sharp from Over the Hedge. Yeah, she has the look and general vibe of an average Karen, sure, but if you ignore her unpleasant personality for just a minute, think about it. What does Gladys really do as an antagonist? I mean, yeah, asking an exterminator to ensure the pest's deaths are as cruel as possible is a step too far.
That's exactly why I called the exterminator, to kill them before they get hurt like this.
As is having him install an illegal weapon of mass destruction to ensure victory.
Adios, animal infestation.
But when you think about it, Gladys really was just trying to protect her property. She's still a jerk and possibly a small-scale psychopath though, so even if she didn't totally deserve that jail sentence, I'm honestly glad she got it. Rounding out this category is the one thing more inevitable than a Karen: death. Death is a pretty terrifying concept to think about, and Puss in Boots: The Last Wish has one of its most unsettling renditions yet. After losing the 8th of his 9 lives, Puss literally comes face to face with the Grim Reaper, who's been gunning for him for as long as he's been around.
You didn't even notice me, because Puss in Boots laughs in the face of death, right?
Now, on one hand, we're talking about the literal embodiment of the cessation of life here, so there's genuinely no amount of moral mental gymnastics that could frame him as anything but a villain. That said, he's also a villain who's simply doing his job of taking souls to the afterlife. Everyone dies eventually, and death doesn't control how or when. He's just, well, he is. Still, he does thrive off the fear people place in him, so we aren't gonna call him an ethical entrepreneur either. But moving past death, it's time to talk about the actual bad guys from Dreamworks' filmography, the ones with crimes that warrant the label of villain. And no, not those bad guys. Definitely ready for that sequel though. We do start this year off with another furry anthropomorphic bad guy though, Tai Lung from Kung Fu Panda. Now, in his defense, I think there's a sincere case to be made that Tai Lung should be in the previous category. He does genuinely have a tragic past, given how Shifu literally raised him to be the future dragon warrior, only to have that dream snatched from him by Oogway's wisdom, with Shifu silently going along with it. His world crumbling before him, Tai Lung responded by trying to attack Oogway, which got him a lengthy prison sentence. When he broke out, he plotted to attack the Valley of Peace ruthlessly, showing that he was more than willing to hurt innocent people who had nothing to do with his trauma. So, like, if we've got any anime fans in the crowd, he's basically Dabi from My Hero Academia. Thankfully, Tai Lung got something adjacent to a redemption when he made a minor appearance in Kung Fu Panda 4. He was one of the many masters whose kung fu skill was taken by the chameleon for herself. And after Po saves him, Tai Lung leads the group in bowing in thanks to Po.
See you on the other side, Dragon Warrior.
Acknowledging him as a worthy dragon warrior. This could honestly be the start of a pretty sweet redemption arc for Tai Lung, but until we see that come to fruition, we'll just call him the least evil of the full-on villains we discussed today. Hailing from over the hedge is the brutal black bear, Vincent. RJ has to steal to get food. He's a wild raccoon living near the suburbs, after all. But stealing from his fellow animals proves to be possibly fatal when he goes after Vincent. And when RJ not only tries to steal all his food, but ends up getting it completely destroyed, Vincent offers him an ultimatum.
I can get it! All of it!
My red wagon?
Redder! Ow!
Either RJ give him every last bit of food he stole by the end of the week, or RJ is his food by the end of the week.
And don't even think about running away, because if you do, I will hunt you down and kill you.
No matter your view on capital punishment, you can't deny that being eaten alive as punishment for theft has got to constitute as cruel and unusual punishment, right? Still, bears gotta eat, so we can at least sympathize with him as far as that goes. Sticking in the forest for now, we have the newest Dreamworks villain, Mantra from The Wild Robot. While she does directly call herself a morally neutral character, I'm not entirely sure I buy that. Even if she's programmed to be as nefarious as she is, despite her friendly demeanor suggesting otherwise, we have our doubts about whether she really needs to go as far as she does. This girl initially started a massive forest fire in pursuit of a single robot, all for the sake of a company that, by all accounts, probably doesn't have a care in the world for her. I guess in her defense, she is just doing her job, but unlike Death, she's willing to consider plenty of stuff as collateral damage in pursuit of her task. She's not exactly evil, but I wouldn't trust this weird robot jellyfish thing as far as I can throw it. Pick number whatever this is, my lord. That's where Thelonious will be. Thelonious is Farquaad's right-hand man, a high-ranking executioner and dungeon worker who's willing to perform whatever dirty work his lord desires.
Thelonious...
He doesn't seem to be entirely there, especially given how he apparently doesn't know the difference between 2 and 3, giving him the Darwin Sinner medal. 3! Pick number 3, my lord! Still, any points he'd gained for his incompetence are lost by the fact that for some unfathomable reason he still serves Farquaad after the latter is dead. Fiona and Shrek invite you to their wedding after everything, and this is how you thank them. For shame, Thelonious, you're better than that. Caseworker Miss Grunion is up next. We've seen all kinds of prejudiced villains here at Wicked Binge, but a speciesist villain is a very unique thing. Miss Grunion is of the strong opinion that a dog cannot raise a human boy.
In my opinion, a dog can never be a suitable parent to a little boy.
Which, I mean, I guess I've heard worse takes than that, but that doesn't excuse the fact that she uses Sherman defending himself against a bully as a jumping off point to her quest to get him taken from Mr. Peabody.
I hope I've made myself clear.
It's clear that she doesn't care about the kids she helps, but really just seems to enjoy the power she holds against others. Not to mention, she's one of those people who considers defending herself against a bully to be just as bad as being a bully, which makes her deserving of a high spot on this list regardless. Madagascar 2's main antagonist, Makunga, is up next. If you put Scar from The Lion King and Gaston from Beauty and the Beast in a blender, you'd have something like this wannabe king of the jungle. Makunga wants to be the alpha lion solely so he can tell others what to do, and that's a sentiment he doesn't exactly try to hide.
I'm better looking, I have better hair, I'm deceivingly smart, and I want everyone else to do what I say.
What he does try to hide, however, is his utter incompetence. He resorts to manipulation and scheming to achieve his goals, by forcing Alex into fighting a much stronger lion and thereby forcing Zuba to give up his position as alpha lion for not banishing his boy.
Sadly, the alpha lion must cast out all failures.
Makunga achieved his goal and proved himself to be a pretty crummy leader. He failed to come up with any solution to the drought that didn't involve fighting or bossing people around and ended up being dethroned by an old lady, who technically must qualify as the alpha lion now, right? I think that's a good career choice for her. Following him is another Madagascar villain, Chantal Dubois. Really, she's similar in moral code to Verminator, just way, way more extreme.
Now you deal with me.
See, Dubois' occupation is more than just a job, it's a hobby too. She collects the heads of animals she takes out and mounts them on her wall, with the mighty lion being her most coveted target. When Alex and the gang end up stranded in Europe, it's as if the gods have given Dubois a perfect opportunity, and she uses everything at her disposal for the sake of hunting this lion down.
A lion?
Abusing her employees along the way. I guess it's good that she's taking out her psychological issues on animals instead of humans, but, well, it's not really good, just less bad. Though not quite as inhumane as some others, Prince Charming is one of the most unsavory characters in the Shrek franchise.
The bravest and most handsome in all the land.
Look, I'll give him this. He was literally raised by Fairy Godmother to defeat the dragon and save Princess Fiona, so the fact that an ogre indirectly stole his life's purpose must have been pretty rough.
I will smite him where he stands. He will rue the very day he stole my kingdom from me!
But that doesn't necessarily justify his attempts to rally other misfit fairy tale creatures against heroes like Shrek, essentially staging a coup against Far, Far Away.
Pretty unfair.
Attempted murder and conspiracy are pretty bad, but honestly, this may be a hot take, but I kind of feel bad for Charming. Trying to kill Shrek is not cool, like at all. But you have to remember, this guy's mother spoiled him rotten over his entire life, only for the great rewards he was promised to be snatched away, and just a few days later, so was his mother. Charming isn't a good guy by any means, but he's at least one of the last villains on the list we can feel kinda sorry for. She may be much less of a threat than the Dawn, but Lola definitely deserves a noteworthy spot on our list. Right off the bat, I think Lola deserves the Greed Center Medal. The term gold digger was invented for people like Lola or Fish, like whatever.
Well, I guess that makes me Oscar
The millionaire. The millionaire. The millionaire. The millionaire.
She literally only showed interest in Oscar because he had potential to strike it rich, and when she doesn't get what she wants, she'll go after the one thing she wants more than money: revenge. Being involved with Don Lino basically makes her a class traitor on top of already being a gold digger. She's not a villain who ranks this high because of exceptionally dangerous motives, but rather for a lack of any sympathetic qualities. This fish belongs to the reefs. Closing out this section is the true villain of Megamind, Titan. They say that power doesn't corrupt. It reveals. For example, what happens when you give a stereotypical incel superpowers? You get Titan, the superpowered form of Hal Stewart.
With my power and your big-headedness, we could rule the city.
His obvious crush on Roxanne Ritchie was one of the biggest motivations to become a powerful hero for him. That is, until she rejects him. This leads to Titan not only abandoning Roxanne on top of a building, but also to him using his powers to cause meaningless destruction all across Metro City. This breaking point earns Hal the Lust Sinner Medal. He's basically the superhuman neckbeard equivalent of a kid throwing a tantrum because he didn't get the toy he wanted.
Let me guess. After seeing how awesome I am, you finally come to your senses. Well, I'm over you.
But anyone with motives like that can't be totally evil, so we'll give him some leeway and keep him out of our highest categories. We're starting to venture into the characters who embody villainy to their very core. They are the truly villainous characters. First up in this category is Victor Quatermain from Wallace and Gromit: Curse of the Were-Rabbit. Oddly enough, he bears similarities to the last two villains. Like Hal, he wants to get with a woman desperately, but like Lola, it's only for the money, baby.
What you see is what you get.
He completely ignores Lady Tottington's desire for the rabbits on her property to be dealt with humanely and constantly harasses her and the animals she desperately wants to protect. Even after finding out that the were-rabbit is Wallace, he's more than willing to shoot him with a rifle.
All right, so what if it is that blithering idiot? No one will ever believe you.
Which definitely makes him a worse gold digger than Lola, since at least she wasn't an attempted murderer. Now we're cooking. Next up is Chef Bergen from the original Trolls. Now, we're really trying to be as sympathetic as we can with these villains. For instance, if I were exiled from my entire community for an honest mistake that I had no control over, I'd be pretty desperate to get back on good terms with them too. But while I won't claim to be perfect at all, I like to imagine that I wouldn't try and manipulate my friends and neighbors into believing that the only way to achieve happiness is by eating small, defenseless creatures and forcing them to do so even when I'm blatantly proven wrong.
That's right. A calm troll is a tasty troll.
Still, the fact that the chef-themed villain was defeated in the end by getting eaten is some beautiful irony, especially since she was about to double-cross Creek, but since Creek was also a double-crosser, I'm not even sure what you'd call that from a moral standpoint. Next is another chef, but this one is more motivated by money. Mrs. Tweedy from Chicken Run. They say that hurting or killing animals is one of the earliest signs of psychopathy in a child, so with that being the case, I think you can probably imagine that a woman running her chicken farm like a death camp has more than a few red flags. Her love for tormenting chickens is awful, especially since it's all for the sake of money, but that alone wouldn't get her quite this high up. What does, however, is her abuse of Mr. Tweedy. She's physically, verbally, and emotionally hurting him constantly and uses him as little more than a manservant for her evil schemes.
It's a pie machine, you idiot. Chickens go in, pies come out.
Honestly, at a certain point, you can't even consider him a full-on antagonist, and while her relationship with Dr. Fry wasn't as bad, that doesn't erase everything she put her ex-husband through.
It's all in your head, Mr. Tweedy. Say it.
Hopefully being at the center of another explosion taught her a valuable lesson. It probably didn't, though. Up next is the villain of Flushed Away, the Toad. Another one of the villains who comes so close to being sympathetic. The Toad's origin story is that of an abandoned pet. When he was flushed down the toilet and replaced by Prince Charles's shiny new pet rat, he gained a hatred of rats altogether. But despite his grudge, he still tried to be sympathetic towards fellow upper-class pet Roddy. That is, until Roddy single-handedly destroyed his prized art collection, intensifying his hatred of Roddy's kind.
Daddy will get rid of them all. He will. They'll all be ditty-witty.
But even if this hadn't happened, it wouldn't take away from the Toad's ruthlessness.
What do you think?
He's a madman! Run away! Run!
Pardon me.
He not only keeps his enemies frozen as trophies, but he ultimately plans to flood Ratropolis, effectively mass murdering the entire population to finally vent his rage against them. Though he's not the only one who let hatred of another species take over, but for Dave the Octopus, his hatred spread even wider and was executed in a more brutal fashion.
What? Are you kidding me?
See, Dave became envious of the penguins when they showed up at the Central Park Zoo. When their cuteness took away all the attention that used to belong to Dave, he gained a grudge against not just them, but all cute and cuddly animals in the world? Yeah, that earns him the Envy Sinner Medal, since his jealousy led him to invent the Medusa Serum to make them so ugly that society would totally turn on them. How would this help Dave regain the love of the public, you may ask? Well, I mean, you can ask, but I still don't know the answer. I don't know.
And then what? You think that's gonna make everybody love
love you? No, but they'll despise you.
All I do know is that anyone who hates penguins can't possibly be innocent.
Sorry. Wait, I live this way.
The calculating villain of Shrek 2, Fairy Godmother, is up next. She's not exactly falsely advertising her services, she's just making them sound way nicer than they actually are.
Now don't worry. I'm here to make it all better.
When she says happiness is just a teardrop away, what she really means is that she's been plotting her son's entire life for him, striking a deal with Fiona's parents to relieve her of her curse in exchange for her marrying Prince Charming.
Oh, believe me, Harold, it's what's best. Not only for your daughter, but for your kingdom.
It's a calculated way of attempting some form of world domination, but one that came remarkably close to success and took advantage of her son and an entire family, leaving their happiness basically hanging in the balance as blackmail. Still, she was kind enough to give us that cover of I Need a Hero, so well, kudos for that at least. Just shy of our top 20, yes, really, we have Zekel Khan from The Road to El Dorado.
Good morning, my lords.
Corrupt priests are bad enough on their own, but when they believe in making human sacrifices to their gods, they reach an entirely new level of dangerousness. To Zekel Khan, people are less like people and more like currency to buy the favor of the gods with. He's undoubtedly killed countless people in his career, if you can even call it a career.
It seems to be missing something. Ah, that's it.
And won't even hesitate to throw away his own acolyte for the sake of more power. Poe's least intimidating villain, the Chameleon, is next. If you're afraid of lizards or stairs, you might want to click off this video now because this talent-stealing reptile won't go easy on you. Even the dead aren't safe from her, given that her whole scheme is to steal the power of Kung Fu masters present and past, including Shen, Tai Lung, and Kai, just to name a few.
Huh? This reptilian runt wants more.
The closest thing we can point out as a good characteristic of the Chameleons is the fact that she took in an orphaned Zhen as a young girl, and even then it was mostly because she saw potential in her to help fulfill her dreams of Kung Fu greatness. In actuality, the only reason she isn't ranked higher is the fact that the remaining baddies have more dangerous ambitions than just copycat Kung Fu. Like, for instance, let's move on from a character whose plan revolved around stealing the talent of famous celebrities to one whose plan revolved around stealing the talent of famous celebrities. It's Velvet from Trolls band together. Quite the long way from her brother, Velvet ranks this high for being the mastermind behind the fraudulent pop duo's plan. She kidnaps Floyd as a means of harvesting his talent to take for herself and her brother to become famous, and by doing so, she also plans to lure the rest of Brozone to them as a rescue mission, or from her standpoint, a replacement of batteries.
That's what I'm going for.
She's fully aware of the fact that she's torturing the trolls to do this, having none of the compassion or accountability of her brother. Ultimately, her desperation to perform on as large a scale as possible is her downfall, which earns her the Pride Cinema Medal and a devilishly devious spot on our list. One of the smartest villains on the entire list next is Professor Poopy Pants. Don't let his name fool you, Poopy Pants is no joke. In fact, if he had his way, nothing would be a joke, because his plan was to destroy all laughter in the world so nobody would laugh at his name again.
Higher capacity for laughter. For years, I've tried to shrink it or cut it out entirely.
If you don't think that warrants such a high spot on our list, let me rephrase that. The guy is literally planning to lobotomize the world, particularly children, to ensure they can never experience full joy.
Still give you the chuckles now? Poopy Pants?
I don't get it.
I get the embarrassment, dude, but you somehow outdid yourself by getting beaten up by an obese man in his tidy whities. All of those smarts, and you couldn't just think of getting a name change? Dr. Zara is one of our coldest villains, which makes sense considering her origin movie. While Burnish is pretty ruthless in his pursuit of Everest, he's a puppy in a field of butterflies next to Zara. Dr. Zara isn't trying to further science or protect endangered animals or anything. Zara is concerned with two things: fame and fortune. When Burnish is revealed to be, not a horrible person, Zara decides she's no longer interested in being employed by him and starts rushing to capture the mighty Yeti at any cost.
Quick! Mr. Burnish needs help!
She doesn't even think twice about pushing Yi, who was a 16-year-old kid, mind you, off a bridge, which could have led to a gruesome death if this weren't a kid's movie. That's not cool, Dr. Zara! Unlike you at the end of the movie. Too far? Nah, just right. Clearly, we're really starting to get into the ruthless antagonists now, and next up is Chelsea Van Der Zee. I'll admit that Ruby Gillman Teenage Kraken is one of DreamWorks' less remarkable movies, but one area it did not slack in was in the ruthless villain category. As it turns out, Chelsea is actually Nerissa Undercover, the very same mermaid queen who was defeated by Ruby's mother 15 years prior.
I still can't believe your mom hid all of this from you.
This mermaid waited 15 years to psychologically manipulate her enemy's daughter into helping her get the power to wipe out krakens and take over the ocean.
Oh, there is no Chelsea.
While being born into a culture of war is pretty bad, dragging a kid into it via psychological manipulation is a low blow, and one that makes her worthy of the Wrath Center Medal. Like, seriously, girl, 15 years? At that point, just find another teenager to manipulate. Jeez, that's just bad business. And it's only going to get worse from here on out. We've now gone beyond the point of no return. These are the irredeemably evil villains. And who better to start off this category with than a classic biblical villain, King Ramses II from the Prince of Egypt. The Pharaoh of Egypt and adoptive brother of Moses, Ramses contributed greatly to the Egyptians' persecution of the Jews, using them as slaves to build their monuments, or whatever he felt like forcing them to do that day. He didn't lift a finger to stop other Egyptians from abusing them, even the elderly and handicapped. He's a seriously messed up guy, and I feel like I could finish this entry right here because slavery is bad is a pretty simple concept for most people.
Please, you must listen. I will not be the weak link.
The only thing keeping him from landing any higher is the fact that he did genuinely seem to care for his family, especially his now departed firstborn son. But even so, if he just freed the Jews like Moses and literally God himself told him to, he could have spared his people all that suffering.
Leave me.
While we can pity him a little bit, Ramses got what was coming to him. It's just sad that his people had to suffer for it. Continuing the age-old archetype of slave-owning Dreamworks villains, Professor Marmalade is your guinea pig. It's ironic that the wolf in sheep's clothing archetype was revealed by double-crossing a literal wolf who turned out to be a good guy. Marmalade, on the other hand, painted himself as a charitable and altruistic guy who believed everyone had some good within themselves.
Some have described your goodness as second only to Mother Teresa.
Oh, Tiffany, it's not a competition.
But through some seriously elaborate manipulation, he managed to trick the bad guys into stealing the meteorite for him, allowing him to use other guinea pigs as drones to do his dirty work. Seriously, Marmalade, a guinea pig, is using other brainwashed guinea pigs as remote-controlled servants. Everything he does keeps his own hands clean, and to make him even worse, rather than just keeping the money he donates to charity, he has it driven right to its destination, only to have it stolen at the very last moment.
You see, I never cared about what's good, only what's good for me. Like, say, $1 billion. Ooh, I just got a tingle.
He's a greedy, sadistic little scumbag, which is really the last thing you'd expect to say about a little hamster-looking guy. Man, he is good at being evil. One of the strangest villains in today's discussion, Francis E. Francis, is next. Okay, seriously, a lactose-intolerant baby?
It turns out I was lactose intolerant.
No. That just has to be a glitch, surely. I wouldn't blame Franklin for being mad at God or the stork or whatever made him in this twisted world of imagination, but the man decides to hold a grudge against babies? I mean, like, I get it. He's one of the babies assigned to management, so he's an adult in a baby's body. It makes sense that he'd consider it worth blaming the co-workers who got him booted out of the company, but he goes a few hundred baby steps further by plotting to make a puppy so adorable that it takes away all humanity's love for babies for itself.
And I'm finally going to get revenge with the forever puppy.
It's all done out of spite and with no sympathy for the literal babies who, he believes at least, will be neglected indefinitely as a result. Okay, next we have the first How to Train Your Dragon villain, Red Death. I'm not sure why he's called Red Death since he's like 85% gray, but whatever color this dragon is, I know that his heart is straight up absent. Red Death forces the other dragons to bring humans to him as food, basically acting as a king waiting for his servants to cater to his every whim.
Totally makes sense. It's like a giant beehive. They're the workers, and that's their queen. It controls them.
I mean, sure, he's an animal, but dragons in this universe have demonstrated pretty decent intellect before, like Toothless and his legendary artistic talent, so it's not unreasonable to assume that Red Death knows exactly what he's doing, but that is still an assumption, so he falls short of an even more evil spot. Speaking of short, let's move on down to Lord Farquaad. Don't worry, man, we won't make your entry too short. Okay, I swear, that's the last height joke for now. Farquaad may be short, but that doesn't make him a bad guy.
Do you think maybe he's compensating for something?
What does make him a bad guy is the fact that he's an elitist dictator who commissions his army to gather up fairy tale creatures in exchange for money, planning to keep them out of his perfect world.
Perfect.
He's also willing to torture them for information, as seen by his most diabolical moment of all, threatening to take Gingy's gumdrop button.
No, not the buttons! Not my gumdrop buttons!
All right then, who's hiding them?
But if you thought his hatred of fairy tale creatures meant he at least might care about his citizens, well, prepare to be disappointed. Farquaad makes a show out of pitting soldiers against each other, battling for the privilege of going to rescue Fiona from the dragon. Some of them may die, but it's a sacrifice he's willing to make. Maybe next time he should spend less time working on that tower and more time working on himself. Oh wait, he's dead. He may be tiny, but General Mandible has a pretty big rap sheet. Mandible is a legitimate danger to his own people, believing that the strong ants should be the only ones to survive. That's already an animated anime movie villain level of diabolical, and it's made worse by just how far Mandible proves he's willing to go in order to enforce his eat or be eaten society. He was willing to kidnap Princess Bala, force her into marriage to create what he would consider a master race, and even drown the entire colony of worker ants, all for the sake of his dictator-level scheme.
A fresh start. Imagine it.
A strong colony, sir.
Farquaad almost seems kind of tame at this point, doesn't he? It's all downhill from here. We've reached the point where characters no longer have any redeeming qualities, starting off with Rumpelstiltskin.
Okay, go.
Somehow, an even more dangerous version of the fairy godmother in terms of his plan, Rumple took advantage of Shrek's frustration with mundane family life to trick him into giving up the day he was born. This resulted in Fiona never being rescued, and through a bunch of other events, in Rumple and his contract-loving, wig-wearing self ruling far, far away.
You signed the kingdom of far, far away over to me.
He rules it with an iron fist, regularly threatening the witches who serve him with a nice, refreshing glass of water, and he even has the nerve to take credit for a plan he got from a witch he literally just murdered.
You know, actually not a bad idea.
Rumple is fairly ruthless, and I'm not going to act like he has any good qualities that keep him from landing at an even higher spot. It's just that the remaining villains are even worse. With that, let's talk about Lord Shen from Kung Fu Panda 2. This perilous peacock, like a concerning amount of villains on today's list, is guilty of full-on genocide.
China will be mine.
After being told by a seer that his end would come from a warrior of black and white, he took the totally reasonable precaution of killing every panda he could find. When he discovered that Po, being a panda, believe it or not, was still alive, he devoted all his resources to taking him out so nobody could stop his tyrannical reign. Shen's actions might have started out as a desire to protect himself, which could count as self-defense, albeit an extremely twisted, sick form of it, but he took great pleasure in killing innocent pandas and any other creature who dared to get in his way.
In front of all the world, you and your precious Kung Fu will die.
Even being offered mercy from Po, the very warrior he was afraid of, that didn't change Shen's mind, showing that he was fully committed to full-on villainy. Next we have the third How to Train Your Dragon movie's villain, Grimmel the Grizzly. He's a dark reflection of Hiccup, having similarly found a Night Fury at a young age, but instead of befriending it, he killed it. This led to a plot to eradicate all dragons from the world, except for dragons he enslaved for the sole purpose of killing dragons, of course.
So I decided to kill every last one, bringing real peace to the people of this world.
Yeah, this guy's pretty screwed up. In his plan of dragon genocide, he was willing to threaten not just Hiccup, but the entirety of Berk's lives if they didn't surrender their dragons. Even though he died, he technically did get Berk to surrender their dragons, but they'll be living in peace away from mankind, which means that Grimmel somehow both succeeded and completely utterly failed at the same time. Congratulations on losing, Grimmel? Up next, and just outside of our top 5 most evil, we have Drago Bloodfist. On the next episode of Villain Who Laughs in the Face of Mercy, we have Drago, another dark foil to Hiccup, who instead of training dragons prefers to enslave them and use them to take all the power he can get his big grubby paws on. War criminals are surprisingly par for the course for this final category, but what sets Drago apart is just how blunt he is. This guy makes it no secret that he fully intends to rule the world as the true alpha, controlling dragons and humans alike through sheer force and intimidation. He even briefly gets control of Toothless, attempting to kill Hiccup, but instead killing Stoic, who heroically sacrificed himself. Drago is ruthless and unapologetically evil, but even then, he pales in comparison to our remaining villains. One of our contenders for the gold medal, Pitch Black from Rise of the Guardians, is next. Pitch might initially seem like a pure evil character, and to an extent, he is.
Why, there's only one thing missing. A touch of fear. That never gets old.
I mean, the man's goal is to destroy all children's hopes, dreams, and belief in the Guardians, and on a larger scale, to plunge the world into eternal darkness. So, why isn't he getting the gold medal of evil? Well, simply put, there's the chance that Pitch Black is actually a kind of tragic villain. It's implied that he was ostracized from the Guardians, and that his power, once meant to keep people on the straight and narrow, was corrupted by nightmares. It excuses nothing he did throughout the movie, much less his attempt to bring Jack Frost to the dark side, but you can't help but wonder if Pitch Black would have at least been less evil if he'd only had some friends. Whoa! What took us so long to mention Jack Horner on our list? He's an irredeemable monster, and like Drago, he doesn't try to hide it. That said, it might be weird to place him even lower than Drago of all villains, considering he's a much more lighthearted villain.
I couldn't get this rock off of it, but it's still pretty cool, right?
But comic relief aside, this guy's one of the most unapologetically depraved villains on the whole list.
Well, you know what they say. Can't bake a pie without losing a dozen men.
Oh,
Anyone who'd casually shoot a puppy in the face without hesitation is undeniably one of the worst kinds of people on the planet. And that's not even to mention his goal to essentially form a monopoly on magic, becoming supreme ruler of the world. Hopefully this isn't insensitive, but Jack gets today's Gluttony Sinner Medal for his desire to hoard all the magic in the universe for himself, which I think is a pretty good reason. When even your conscience gives up on you, you've earned your spot as one of the most evil on the list. Taking our bronze medal of evil, we have the final Kung Fu Panda, Kai the Collector. Shen is widely considered the most evil Kung Fu Panda antagonist, which is totally valid, and honestly, we were leaning towards that conclusion. But here's the thing about Kai. As a former friend of Oogway, the pair discovered a village of pandas who taught them about Qi. Almost immediately, the revelation of this power corrupted Kai, and he took it upon himself to attack the village, stealing all the pandas' Qi for himself. He and Oogway had an earth-shaking battle as a result, and Kai was banished to the spirit world, at which point he decided to destroy Oogway's legacy as revenge, then finishing his whole Qi-stealing debacle.
Then we'll finish it here.
Like Jack Horner, he wanted to take all the magical power in the universe for himself, which Poe gladly granted him. Unfortunately, godlike power isn't exactly manageable if, you know, you're not a god, and Kai's stay in the spirit world was therefore upgraded to a lifetime membership. Say hi to Tai Lung for me, Kai. Speaking of the afterlife, the Silver Medal of Evil goes to Eris, goddess of chaos from Sinbad, Legend of the Seven Seas. As her name implies, Eris is a goddess of chaos, and alongside her top-tier bro Proteus, she's basically the best part of the movie.
Glorious chaos.
She creates chaos for no reason but chaos itself, which is truly chaotic, taking a great pleasure in toying with the earth and its inhabitants, from framing Sinbad for her own thefts to blackmailing him into doing her bidding. At first glance, it might seem like she has a sense of integrity due to her keeping her word to Sinbad, but that's only because, by her own admission, she's bound for eternity. If that temper tantrum near the end of the movie was anything to go by, if Eris had her way, she would not be letting Sinbad sail any more of those seven seas, and to cement her top spot, she straight up says the only reason she leaves his side is that she has more people to screw around with. Honestly, that level of pettiness is almost respectable. Almost.
I've got places to go, things to destroy, stuff to steal.
And you guys can say hi to our gold medalist of evil, Galaxar, from Monsters vs. Aliens. Most of the villains we've talked about so far have had one important thing in common. They had a reason for doing what they did. Even Eris, she is literally the goddess of chaos, so, like, what else is she gonna do? Now, on the other hand, I guess Galaxar does have a reason, in a broad sense. He wants to destroy all life on planet Earth to replace it with clones of himself, but why exactly does he want to do that? Good question! The answer seems to be that Galaxar is an absolute psychopath who does whatever he wants, when he wants.
Most of you will not survive the next 24 hours. Those of you that do survive will be enslaved and experimented on. You should in no way take any of this personally. It's just business.
An even better question is why he destroyed his own home planet before the events of the movie, for which the absolute best reason we can give is that his wife kept nagging him to have kids. You probably, hopefully, don't need us to tell you that that is not a proportional response, and that's exactly why he takes our gold medal of evil.
Who dares to wake me?
Galaxar is like if you put Roger from American Dad and Invader Zim in a blender, then removed any sympathetic qualities from them, which isn't a lot really. Your result would be a man with genius intellect, world-dominating ambition, a planet-sized ego, and a complete lack of any moral fibers. That level of evil is something most villains couldn't even dream of, so while he's undeniably a pure evil character, Galaxar should honestly be proud that he managed to be so insanely malicious.
The following sequence contains scenes that are so intense, horrific, and violent, and expensive.
Dreamworks Animation is known for its ups and downs. Some of its films are absolute creative masterpieces. Others are pretty bad.
Whatever happens, I must not cry.
So today we're ranking them all from worst to best. This is the Dreamworks Animation tier list. Let's start with the bottom of the barrel. The F tier is where we're going to find DreamWorks' worst films, whether they be badly written, incredibly frustrating, or just all around bad. Kicking things off, we have Shrek, the third. Easily considered the worst sequel that DreamWorks has ever made.
I know how it happened.
I just can't believe it.
While it wasn't bad enough to completely kill the Shrek franchise, it certainly did some damage to its reputation. More so than any other Shrek film and many other DreamWorks films, this one seemed primarily focused on pop culture references and gags more than anything else, much to the point of its detriment. It's not particularly funny, and the story is incredibly lackluster given how much of a downgrade Prince Charming is as a solo villain. And speaking of charm, you're not going to find much of that, or much of Shrek's classic heart here. Shrek's anxiety about being a dad feels very by the numbers, and many have pointed out how this only relatable to adult adult subplot combined with the super childish humor of this third installment makes the whole thing come off as very confused, not really knowing what audience they're trying to target, and thus not really being able to please anyone. Overall, this film is just very messy and painfully unfunny, easily making it one of DreamWorks' worst, possibly the worst. Following it, we have Spirit Untamed, another sequel that really had no business being theatrically released considering its connection to the Netflix cartoon. But hey, DreamWorks treated it like a legitimate part of their filmography, so we're gonna judge it by those same merits.
Here we go.
Starting off, while this movie doesn't do anything to ruin the original Spirit's legacy as it's following Spirit's son instead of the famous horse itself, it still doesn't feel like it's really adding anything to the original story. Everything it tries to do just feels like a pale imitation of the moments and themes from the first film, not being unique nor interesting enough to truly stand on its own. Cookie cutter and painfully generic seem like the perfect ways to describe this film, with even the animation not being able to compare to even modern day DreamWorks films, much less the original Spirit.
What? That's not good.
Finally, while Shrek 3 might not have known who its audience was, Spirit Untamed seemed like it's only trying to appeal to young girls who like horses. And while there's nothing wrong with that, it still doesn't try to really be anything extraordinary or amazing, with each of the main characters feeling pretty one-dimensional.
Ride like the wind, Senor Carrots!
It's just boring, predictable, and lacking in personality, unfortunately, and we can't really see anyone, including horse girls, that is, girls that like horses, wanting to watch this movie more than once. Finishing off the F tier, we really couldn't leave this section without talking about Shark Tale. Oh boy, what is there left to say about Shark Tale? This movie is pretty infamous after all, for its poor animation and ugly art, its unlikable characters, and its predictable and incredibly frustrating story. Let's not mince words here, Oscar is a terrible protagonist, and well, that's partially the point.
Oscar, you cute, but you're a nobody.
He doesn't exactly grow nor improve a ton throughout the film, making his eventual happy ending feel, frankly, unearned. The other characters are okay, at best, though the allegories done with Lenny and his whole story haven't exactly aged well. Then there are the gross-out jokes, the abundance of unfunny pop culture references, and just an overall distasteful nature to the film that many can't ignore. But to Shark Tale's credit, at least it wasn't an awful adaptation to an already great film or franchise like the other two films in this tier were. What's more, as bad as Shark Tale is, some people out there have found some ironic enjoyment in it, putting it in that so bad it's good category.
It's not too bad.
Okay, well, maybe good is going a bit too far, as not even the irony and memes can make this film anything better than mediocre. How exactly did this film get an Oscar nomination again? Moving on, we have D tier. While these films are still pretty bad, when compared to the previous tier, these films still have their merits, as few and far between as they may be. First up here, we have DreamWorks' final theatrically released 2D film, Sinbad, Legend of the Seven Seas. It's honestly a shame that it was this film that killed DreamWorks' 2D films, as it has quite a few good elements to it. For one, a film based on the famous adventures of Sinbad is a pretty solid idea, and with the right execution, it could have been an awesome adventure film. There are also some strong characters and dynamics to be found here, namely the character of Eris, who, let's be real here, has some downright spectacular animation and flair to her, as well as the fairly enjoyable, if perhaps a bit cliche, relationship between Sinbad, Proteus, and Marina. However, the film still has a few things holding it back, such as some poorly implemented CG monsters, some hit-or-miss humor, and some undercooked story elements that keep it from reaching its true potential. Still, we can understand why this movie is a guilty pleasure, or a hidden gem for some DreamWorks fans. From adventuring swashbucklers to racing snails, let's talk about Turbo, shall we? You'd think a movie about a snail wanting to go fast and win the Indy 500 would be more interesting. Unfortunately, while some fans may be able to get some charm and endearment out of this movie and its characters, it overall feels like a been there, done that concept that ends up not being as inventive as it could have been. Its predictability is seen as the film's biggest detriment, though some are still able to find some enjoyment in how funny or heartwarming Turbo can occasionally be.
You clearly got the skills to pay the bills. If snails had to pay bills then.
True, it may not be able to stand up against some of DreamWorks' brightest and strongest films, but for what it is, Turbo at the end of the day comes off as more lacking than outright bad or unwatchable. It's generic, yeah, but there's nothing truly egregious or awful about it. Heck, you may even get a laugh or aww out of it, and that's still something. Though whether or not you want to try to claim it's a rip-off mix of Ratatouille and Cars is another story. Next in this tier is another sequel, that being The Boss Baby, Family Business. We'll be talking about the first Boss Baby later, but for now, we'll just say that the first movie managed to still have some moments of charm and heart amidst all the wackiness and the completely off-the-wall concept. The sequel, meanwhile, ends up pushing things to the extreme by both bringing in a new Boss Baby and by turning the Templeton brothers back into a kid and a baby respectively. Yeah, this film has just gone all in on the absurdity of the franchise, completely forgoing the whole, oh, this could be a story / imaginary aspect of the original film. Speaking of which, it can also be said that this sequel tries tries just a bit too hard when it comes to doing callbacks to the original Boss Baby, but as unappealing as the extra craziness may be for some people,
how about a standing ovation?
it may just be the thing that other people are looking for. We'll also hand it to Family Business in that it still tries to focus on the family aspect of the franchise, adding a bit of sweetness to all this silliness. You could argue that many other DreamWorks movies do this aspect better, but we'll still give this movie some credit where it's due, even if its overall package will still likely only appeal to young kids. Wrapping up the D's, that doesn't sound right, is the fairly disappointing coming-of-age film that was Ruby Gillman, Teenage Kraken. For as much as this movie may have had a really cool concept, most would say that it just didn't really come together in the end. It's another DreamWorks film that ends up being pretty lacking in the story department, coming off as an incredibly predictable and half-baked, especially if you know the genre tropes that the movie's basing itself on. Many were also disappointed in the main villain, Chelsea, wanting her to be much more than just the one-dimensional backstabbing bad guy that she ended up being. The animation and art style also leaves something to be desired, though for what it's worth, it's still not as bad as Shark Tale. Additionally, for as generic and predictable as the movie may be, the action and some of the moments between Ruby and her mother can still be pretty enjoyable. It may not be a complete shipwreck, though we certainly understand why some people would rather write their own version of the film. Next up, we have the C-tier DreamWorks films, the ones that land right in the middle in terms of being pretty average and okay when it comes to their stories, jokes, and animation. First up is the sci-fi buddy comedy Home. Being seen as another one of DreamWorks' more kiddie films, it's actually not too bad. For one, a lot of the sci-fi tech shown within the film can be pretty cool and is used for some pretty dynamic scenes. The main characters have a nice rapport with each other, while the aliens themselves can actually be pretty funny when they want to be.
Now he is vibrating. Is he going to explode?
Sure, some aspects of the film are still kind of dumb, and sometimes O's voice and style of speaking can get agitating.
Tip cannot come into that out now.
But the movie never gets to that level of being truly aggravating. We've also got to give some praise to the climax, with O choosing to do the right thing and face the Gorg, as it actually manages to be fairly emotional and memorable, allowing the film to further stand out in spite of it primarily being a simple alien road trip movie. At worst, the film just kind of feels familiar and maybe doesn't do anything too daring, but that still doesn't necessarily make it bad. While kids might still get the most enjoyment out of it, that certainly doesn't mean that they're the only ones who could enjoy Home. Getting back to the studio's earlier films, next up is Ants. Ah yes, DreamWorks' first film. Is it an underrated classic that got overshadowed by the films that followed it? Well, not exactly.
Hey, it is crap. Not bad.
While there's certainly some merit here in terms of the animation and the sheer ambition, some feel this movie has a bit of a tone problem to where you aren't quite sure if it's meant to be more for families or for adults due to how mature some of its jokes are.
You know, I was gonna let you become part of my most erotic fantasies.
Not to mention all the violence in the movie. To be fair, there are some people out there who really enjoy its themes related to class struggle and its sense of humor, seeing it as a very sharp sort of film. And in terms of how it compares to other DreamWorks films, we can certainly praise its uniqueness. Others, however, may not find the story, art, nor humor of the film as very appealing, being unable to fully latch onto the film's shifting tone or seeing it as too dark in some aspects. More so than most of DreamWorks' other films, this one seems most reliant on personal tastes. And if you ask us, we'd say it manages to land right in the middle, for better or for worse. Next, we have the original Boss Baby. Love it or hate it, there's no denying that this is one of DreamWorks' biggest current franchises, and in its best moments, it can actually be pretty heartwarming and even a bit funny.
I poop, they wipe, bam! I'm the boss.
Granted, those moments can still be few and far between, but they're still present regardless. The film keeps a nice balance between being wacky and being more grounded depending on what the scene needs, and Tim's imagination spots, as well as the animation shift that happens during them, are seen by many as the highlight of the film. The overall lesson, while perhaps a bit predictable, is also really sweet, so while the potty and baby-related humor may get tiresome after a while, we feel there's enough here to put it right in the middle of DreamWorks' catalog. For what it is, we're sure it could have been a lot more gross or annoying, though let's be real here, this movie still didn't exactly earn its Oscar nom. Just ahead of Boss Baby, we're gonna rank The Croods next. While this could have easily just been DreamWorks' take on the Flintstones, this film does manage to feel like its own thing, even if that thing is still a pretty simple film at the end of the day. For what it's worth, we have to give a ton of props to this film's character, creature, and environment designs, as these things combined do a lot to give this somewhat cliche premise its own identity. Additionally, while they may be pretty archetypal, the Croods themselves still manage to be pretty likable. The jokes can range from silly to dumb, with not every joke landing, but the humor overall is never too aggravating, thankfully. At worst, you could say this movie is maybe a bit too simple or a bit too predictable, leading to it mostly feeling like a kids-only flick. Though with a solid enough start and a pretty good climax, we'd say that this family has earned a fairly high spot in our ranking. We've finally arrived at one of Dreamworks' collaborations with Aardman Animation, presenting the literally underground comedy Flushed Away. It's unfortunate to say, but Flushed Away is typically seen as one of Aardman's weaker films. But hey, Aardman is still Aardman, so this final collaboration between them and Dreamworks still turned out pretty good in spite of any behind-the-scenes drama. While it may be easy to miss the classic claymation of their previous collaborations, Flushed Away still brings in some fun action sequences that both kids and adults can enjoy. The characters themselves are also fairly likable, if a bit standard. Roddy and Rita are a pretty classic couple archetype, and the film's villains do their job fairly well, even if they aren't the best that either studio has to offer. There are a few setbacks though, like the humor being just a bit too silly and frantic at times. It's another one of those cases where how much you like the film may just depend on your personal tastes. And for many people, this film manages to fall right into the category of just being okay. And speaking of okay, that's pretty much how you can describe Abominable 2. A film that coincidentally kind of flew under the radar. This suburban fantasy isn't bad per se, but it's another that overall feels half-baked in spite of its good elements. While we may like the incredibly sweet bond between Yi and Everest, it's not necessarily the most memorable. If anything, it perhaps feels a bit too much like other friendships we've seen from the studio, all while lacking that little bit of extra something that makes it truly memorable. If anything, the most memorable parts of the film are the environments and how Everest uses his Yeti powers, as they provide the most impressive spectacle. Though if you want to talk memorable for the wrong reasons, then we have to bring up the film's twist villain, Dr. Zara.
Yes!
Hey, who says only Disney can have bad twist villains? Yeah, no one really likes nor cares about this lady, with some even considering her addition to be a notable detriment to what could otherwise be seen as a pretty standard kids' fantasy film.
Everest, look, make a wish.
It's fun and sweet and certainly pretty, but these things can't quite make up for what the film tends to lack in originality. Moving right along, we have The Croods 2: A New Age, another Dreamworks sequel that some actually see as better than the original. While this franchise hasn't yet managed to reach legendary status, many fans still feel like The Croods was able to produce a surprisingly decent sequel, and we, in case you can't tell, feel the same way. While it may have been easy to just introduce a more modern family, they managed to pull off some fun and clever jokes with it.
Oh, that's just your reflection. It's called a mirror.
Making the Bettermans feel less like just a plot device and more like actually fun characters that we enjoy seeing the Croods interact with. There's some added style and action, not to mention some pretty gorgeous animation in some parts, and the lesson about accepting new ways of life ties in well with the original film. It's not perfect, mind you, as there are still the occasional groaners and eye rolls when it comes to its jokes, and it's still not the deepest story around.
Ugh, this show's for older kids.
Some critics also see it as being too chaotic and wacky at times, but hey, if you're looking for a fun time, these two families may be able to give you exactly what you need. From cavemen to monsters, next up is Monsters vs. Aliens. Some of you may be surprised to see this one so high up, as it's one that many of Dreamworks' more critical fans tend to either pan or overlook, with it kind of being the black sheep of the studio's genre films of the mid-2000s. Still, we think there's more to this film than meets the eye. For one, while its premise may be incredibly goofy and even a bit shallow, the crew behind MVA did a great job making it feel reminiscent of the campy monster and sci-fi B-movies that it was both spoofing and paying tribute to, even if some of the jokes they do in the film are admittedly kinda lame. But regardless, the vibes are certainly there, as is the heart when it comes to our monster leads. It's nice seeing them bond and grow a stronger friendship over the film, but without a doubt, this movie's strongest element is the main character herself, Susan, aka Ginormica.
Did you see how strong I was? There probably isn't a jar in this world I can't open.
Though you could argue it's maybe a bit rushed, her arc of growing more confident in herself is still a great one, especially for Dreamworks' first female lead. We'll acknowledge that this movie still isn't perfect, and that, yeah, this genre isn't for everyone, but the fun characters and even more fun action are still enough for us to give this movie the flowers we feel it deserves. Stepping into the Madagascar franchise, this is where we find Penguins of Madagascar. Comedy relief side characters being unable to hold their own when given the spotlight? It's a tale as old as time, and while this movie wasn't a garbage fire or anything like that, the Penguins of Madagascar weren't able to beat the odds. Given that they already had their own TV show out at the time, we can't blame audience members for not wanting to catch an extended Penguins adventure. For what it's worth, the Penguins themselves still work as fun characters who have a great dynamic with each other. Their feats are just as impressive as they were in the first few Madagascar films, allowing viewers to still be surprised by them every once in a while, even if the shtick has gotten just a bit old at this point. But perhaps the biggest detriment to this film are the other characters that the Penguins have to bounce off of. Namely, a group of Arctic spies called the North Wind and the octopus villain Dave.
Dave! Dave!
Dave!
Dave! Blah.
Additionally, with the whole movie being an extended Penguins bit with no real breaks in between, some people found the movie to be more exhausting than exhilarating. Even if the Penguins still are fun and likable here, you can't help but recall the old phrase of simply having too much of a good thing. Wrapping up the C's, we have the original Puss in Boots. Hey look, another action-filled movie about a comedic side character. Insert the 2 nickels line from Phineas and Ferb here.
If I had a nickel for every time I was doomed by a puppet, I'd have 2 nickels, which isn't a lot, but it's weird that it happened twice.
Anyway, while it might not be as good as most of the Shrek films, this movie isn't bad by any means. If anything, Puss's story within it, from his tragic past to his eventual heroic triumph, is an incredibly strong one. Had the humor in this movie landed at least a bit better, we could see this being a tier or 2 higher easily. Unfortunately, its humor very much lands in the hit or miss sort of range, with some scenes even dragging a bit because of this. Not exactly what you want from a thrilling action comedy. This is also a case where its villains, Humpty Dumpty and the married crime couple Jack and Jill, also end up being somewhat of a detriment due to them not being as strong as the franchise's other villains. But hey, still not as bad as Prince Charming in Shrek the Third. Perhaps the most frustrating thing about this movie is just how close it gets to being something truly great, only for a scene or a joke to fall flat and ruin the momentum. Still, it did give us Kitty Softpaws, who's a pretty fun character, and it gave us the "I was there all along" meme with Humpty's reveal, so we'd say this movie's worth existing for those things alone. We've now entered the B-tier films, which is where we start seeing the truly good films. The ones that, while they may not be the best, you understand why they have their fans, as they are truly fun and enjoyable despite any lingering flaws. Time to take a trip to suburbia. We're starting the B-tier off with Over the Hedge. This movie might have aged somewhat, feeling very early 2000s with its references, presentation, and sense of humor, but who says that's a bad thing?
It is bold. I like it.
Over the Hedge manages to thrive in simplicity, being incredibly charming for the most part, while still being able to surprise and catch viewers off guard with some of its bigger gags and wackier jokes.
Was that out loud?
That whole sequence with the dog's squeaky toy? Iconic. Really, save for the predictability that comes with being a liar revealed type of story, the movie manages to be incredibly consistent with its laughs, not to mention its more heartwarming moments. Sure, at the end of the day, it may just be a silly talking animal movie, but based on how good it turned out, we feel it doesn't really need to be anything more than that. What movie is more fitting for the B tier than a movie about bees? Time to talk about B-Movie. Let's face it, the entire concept of this movie and the places it manages to go in such a short amount of time are just absolutely insane. And for many people, that's what they love about it. In terms of just being absurd and off the wall, B-Movie is probably one of the best examples of it in just how well it keeps that balance of being absolutely ridiculous while still being grounded enough for you to care somewhat about the characters.
So you'll just work us to death?
We'll sure try.
And the memes? Do we even need to mention all the iconic memes that came from this movie? It really is kind of incredible in hindsight. However, we will acknowledge that this style of humor certainly isn't for everyone. If you're not a fan of wacky comedy, a more loose style of storytelling, or Jerry Seinfeld's stand-up in general, this movie really doesn't have much left to offer you. Still, you have to respect the sheer ambition and willingness to just kind of do whatever. Only Dreamworks could make a movie like this, and again, that's just part of its charm. You like jazz? We've finally hit another one of the Dreamworks 2D films, Spirit, Stallion of the Cimarron. Almost the complete opposite of the previous film in this tier, Spirit is an absolutely gorgeous looking movie that knows how to take it slow and really take in the environments of the Old West. While some may see it as a bit on the boring side in some parts, we appreciate that this movie isn't afraid to take its time, which in turn allows the more emotional moments to hit that much harder. There are also a ton of thrills in this film, with the last act having possibly the most exciting action sequences that this studio has ever produced. Really, the only downsides we could mention are that its story can come off as pretty simple and its humor can be a bit lacking, which would be fine if it didn't still try to make jokes. Additionally, the narration done by Matt Damon can range from feeling unnecessary to just being annoying. Some people have also critiqued this movie's very contemporary and Bryan Adams-filled soundtrack, which we can also somewhat understand. But those minor flaws aside, this film is still pretty strong for the most part. For this next slot, we're going to be talking about the 3 Trolls films, as if you ask us, they all manage to rank about the same in terms of both their positives as well as their weaknesses within each film. You've got the fun characters, the catchy covers, and occasional original songs that are just as enjoyable to listen to.
And a falsetto made of gold.
Not that anyone cared.
Some surprisingly really funny jokes, the tons of creativity on display when it comes to the Trolls world and the creatures that live within it, but you've also got some pretty simple jokes, some moments that are maybe a bit too wacky and nonsensical, the fart jokes, and other things that may not be everyone's cup of tea. If you ask us, they aren't nearly as bad as some of its biggest detractors would want to claim, actually having quite a bit of substance underneath all that glitter and managing to be some pretty fun films. That being said, we can't ignore how shallow they tend to be in the storytelling department. Though we still appreciate its themes regarding happiness, love, community, and family, you might enjoy these films more or less depending on your sense of humor and your taste in music, but we see it as a pretty solid trilogy. Still, if we have to put them in worst to best order, we'd say that Trolls World Tour probably ranks third, while Band Together and the original Trolls are seen as stronger entries, though again, they're pretty interchangeable at the end of the day. But now it's time to leave the world of Trolls and take a trip to China with the most recent film on this tier list at the time of writing, Kung Fu Panda 4. Perhaps one of the most controversial films in this tier, Kung Fu Panda 4 certainly has its detractors, with it being seen as the weakest of the series. While we can't necessarily disagree with that last statement, we still feel it has enough of its own merit and enough positives to it that we can't hate on it too much. Like the other films in the series, the action is still pretty top-notch. What's more, even after several years, Po hasn't lost his step and is still the likable protagonist he's always been. The lesson this film presents about accepting change is a solid one, and much of its jokes still manage to land. We also appreciate the extra spotlight on Mr. Ping and Li Shan, and while Zhen isn't the deepest character in the franchise, she certainly has her fans thanks to her enjoyable, if a bit cliche, dynamic with Po, and we wouldn't mind seeing what they do with her next. That all being said, the film's villain, the Chameleon, and any story elements connected to her are without a doubt the film's weakest points. Add in the film's breakneck pace, as well as just how predictable it can be, and it manages to fall just short of being as awesome as the first three films. It's not unwatchable by any means, but these notable flaws prevent us from ranking it any higher. Next up, we've got another incredibly consistent DreamWorks trilogy, that being the Madagascar films.
Welcome to Madagascar.
These films really are classics, with a sense of humor that ranges from clever and witty to just plain wacky. The characters of the films, from the main four members of the Madagascar crew to the penguins and the lemurs to the memeable Moto Moto and silly villains like Nana and Captain Dubois, are easily its best aspect. Even when the stories of these films aren't at their strongest, you just can't help but want to watch these guys and the hilarious adventures they go on. There's a lot of heart here as well, not to mention some incredible action and chase sequences that are hard to forget about, such as the dam breaking sequence in the second film, or heck, pretty much any action sequence from the third film. But while each of these films is enjoyable in its own right, it's pretty easy to see that the original had the strongest story, while the sequels, though still having had their own strong emotional moments here and there, were overall more focused on being incredibly wacky comedies, which they succeeded at, to be fair. As such, in terms of ranking, we'd say that Europe's Most Wanted was the so-called worst, followed by Escape to Africa, with the original Madagascar being the best in our opinion. Still, we can't understate that this is a very solid and very consistent set of films. Apologies to all the Jack Frost fans out there, but we're going to be ranking Rise of the Guardians next. Not quite the best of the more dramatic stories that DreamWorks has to offer, but it still manages to rank fairly high up there. Feeling reminiscent of a superhero team-up film but with childhood myths and legends, the presentation of the film and the excellent design and animation found within it managed to capture these vibes pretty well. The theme of belief is a decent one, while the characters, while not the deepest ones around, are still memorable in their own right, with Santa, Easter Bunny, and of course Jack Frost understandably being fan favorites. In terms of flaws, its villain may be a bit lacking to some, not being nearly as threatening as he should be, and its story is a bit on the simple side. Some people may see it as trying to be a bit too serious and epic, in spite of its starring characters and child-friendly concept. It's a film that perhaps deserves more credit. It certainly didn't deserve to be one of DreamWorks' biggest box office bombs, that's for sure. Wrapping up the B's is the time travel family comedy Mr. Peabody and Sherman. Much like other movies in this tier, this movie is just plain old fun, and that's honestly its best quality.
Smell my victory! Smell it!
Well, maybe second best, as many have praised this movie for its focus on family and for having an incredibly sweet father and son relationship at its core. Its sense of humor is also really great, feeling very classic and cartoony for the most part, save for the occasional pop culture or history reference. If there are any notable flaws from the film to talk about, many would point to the inclusion of Penny, who, yeah, is pretty unlikable at the start before becoming a bit of a damsel towards the end. Still, we don't see her as the worst, certainly not bad enough to completely ruin the film. Really, it's the main characters of Peabody and Sherman who bring this film to life, keeping its focus ultimately on the importance of family, adoptive or otherwise, and bringing audiences along for a fun and memorable adventure with a ton of laughs and heart. Nearing the end of our tier list, it's time to talk about the A-tier films, the ones that are almost perfect, but are still truly memorable and incredibly enjoyable in their own right. Starting the A's is what could be considered the most underrated film in the Shrek franchise, that being Shrek 4 Ever After. Perhaps a bit overlooked when it first came out, many have found new appreciation in this film for bringing the franchise back to its roots. You hear the plot synopsis of It's a Wonderful Life, but with Shrek, and you think it's going to be a gimmicky mess. But honestly, it manages to be the exact opposite. Not only is this movie a lot of fun, with some great new elements like alternate character interpretations and a whole army of other ogres for Shrek to interact with.
Feed me, if you dare.
But its emotional moments are arguably some of the strongest in the franchise. Like Shrek telling Fiona how happy he was to get the chance to fall in love with her all over again? How can you not tear up a little at that? And we haven't even mentioned the villain yet, who, by the way, is pretty awesome too. Rumpelstiltskin is a perfect example of a villain who can be funny, cunning, and even a bit threatening all in one. Really, the only thing that keeps this film from possibly being S tier is the somewhat slow and kind of annoying first act, as well as just how much they push Shrek into being a complete jerk. Yes, it's part of his character arc, but some feel him telling Fiona that he wished things could go back to how they were before he rescued her was crossing a line. Outside of these things though, there really is a ton to like in what may or may not still be the last Shrek installment. Fingers crossed for more. From one semi-finale film entry to another, next is Kung Fu Panda 3. For some, the third Kung Fu Panda movie is seen as a step down from the second, being a bit more silly and not as dark, with a villain who isn't as interesting or as much of a personal threat as Lord Shin and Tai Lung were to Po and Shifu, respectively. But in all honesty, we feel like most stories and villains would have had a hard time trying to match, let alone exceed, what was seen in the first two Kung Fu Panda films. So in terms of both being a standalone film and a follow-up, the third film still manages to succeed on both fronts, being a truly good time from beginning to end. It's nice seeing Po continue his journey of identity, and it's equally as enjoyable seeing him bond with his birth father and his fellow pandas before going on to teach them how to defend themselves.
I'm gonna teach Kung Fu.
The action in this movie is just as incredible as it always is in this franchise, as is the animation and overall atmosphere. It may be a bit more on the simple side of things, and it may not be as emotionally resonant for some, but this third film still has plenty of its own positives, enough to solidify it as a worthy member of the franchise's legacy. Following that, we have the animated cult classic, The Road to El Dorado. It's really no surprise that this movie became such a hit with animation fans years after its debut. For many, it's seen as one of Dreamworks' funniest films thanks to its lovable leads Miguel and Tulio, and its willingness to be a bit more mature with its jokes, leaning more on the fun banter between the characters and a more subtle yet quippy type of humor.
Yeah.
It's also seen as one of Dreamworks' most gorgeous films art-wise, having some downright beautiful backgrounds for both the jungle and the city of El Dorado itself. It's a thrilling adventure movie through and through, with some pretty fun sequences to boot, but its characters and the bonds they form with one another are also incredibly enjoyable. And have we mentioned the soundtrack yet? Because yeah, Elton John definitely brought his A-game with this movie.
If they say that I'm a god, that's what I am.
But while the movie has plenty of humor and thrills, there were some critics who felt it was somewhat lacking when it first came out, namely in the emotional department, being just a bit too cartoony for some. But we have to politely disagree, as while yeah, it might not be the deepest story of friendship around, it's still an incredibly fun one. Speaking of having a fun and charming time hopping back over to the Aardman collaborations, let's talk about Wallace and Gromit, Curse of the Were-Rabbit. To put it simply, if you're already a fan of Wallace and Gromit, you're probably gonna love this film. But even if you've never seen the duo's previous shorts, we'd say that it's pretty likely you're still gonna have a good time with this one, as it puts the best elements of Wallace and Gromit front and center. Said elements include charming characters, outstanding claymation, and some pretty good jokes that range from cute to hysterical. It doesn't shy away from being silly and a bit absurd, nor does it try to tone down the darker elements, like the film's villain, Victor Quartermain, just straight up trying to kill Wallace by any means necessary. There's also plenty of heart, allowing the genuine love and friendship that Wallace and Gromit have between each other to shine through perfectly. Through all this, it truly does feel like a film that anyone could enjoy at any age. No wonder this duo is a timeless one. In terms of book animations, Dreamworks has some really great ones that manage to capture the spirit of the original source material perfectly, and no film does that better than Captain Underpants, the first epic movie. If you ask any adult who grew up reading the Captain Underpants books what they thought of the movie, chances are you'll hear something along the lines of how it recaptured their childhood. But even if you've never read the books before, this movie manages to stand on its own thanks to its added elements, such as focusing more on the friendship between Harold and George and their willingness to do whatever it takes to protect expect it, or adding some additional depth to Mr. Krupp, making him more of a sympathetic character instead of just keeping him as a one-dimensional authority figure. The film's sense of humor is also pretty great, knowing how to use its more potty humor-focused jokes well without making them the only types of jokes in the film. You've also got to appreciate the different animation styles used in the film, such as the 2D and even puppets at one point. Still not sold on Captain Underpants, huh? Well, how about the Weird Al song in the credits? If that doesn't sell you on this film,
Captain Underpants, yeah, yeah, yeah.
nothing will. Up next, it's time for an excellent escape with Chicken Run. Yep, our pick for the best DreamWorks Aardman collaboration is their very first one, because sometimes you just get it exactly right on your first try.
We have to work as a team, which means you do everything I tell you.
This film is a thrilling spoof of prison escape movies from beginning to end, featuring some lovable characters who, even after 20 years, are still remembered fondly, not to mention some great jokes and incredible claymation that still holds up.
I don't want to be a pie. I don't like gravy.
Sequences like the pie machine escape, the building of the plane, or the final battle with Mrs. Tweedy are easily some of the best that either studio's produced, and for as fun and silly as this movie can be, the emotions and darker, more poignant elements that can be found behind the story and its flock of characters are what truly push it over the edge into being something extraordinary. You've also got to praise that soundtrack, which just goes hard with every track, kazoos and all. Really, the only negative that most people are able to point to with Chicken Run is that it's another story that relies on the liar revealed trope, but even then, it's hardly the worst example of doing a story like this. Even with that one predictable and sort of played out element, there's still just so much here to love and praise that we had to give it a top spot. Just barely missing out on the top tier, this is unfortunately where we have to rank How to Train Your Dragon: The Hidden World. Another one of DreamWorks' films that you may see a variety of opinions on. Its ranking on many other tier lists out there may vary. For us though, it's a case where its franchise-lasting positives still win out over the iffy choices of this third installment. Pretty much everything you love about the first two Dragons films is still here, allowing it to still feel like a satisfying conclusion to the trilogy. For some people, the bittersweet nature of this finale also adds a lot to it. Others, however, dislike the ending and felt saying goodbye to the dragons, even if temporarily, was ultimately unnecessary. There have been other critiques too, like the film's villain Gristle not being anything to write home about, the occasionally inconsistent tone, or the annoying focus on Hiccup's human crew. Even so, its animation remains stunning, while its themes still manage to hit home with a lot of fans, allowing the How to Train Your Dragon series to remain a fairly consistent one as it ends things off on a pretty high note. Kicking off our top 10 DreamWorks films is the last film within the A tier, The Bad Guys. One of DreamWorks' most well-loved recent hits, The Bad Guys is not only a powerhouse in its own right, but it's also a fun return to DreamWorks' genre films, this time being the studio's take on a heist movie, which it captures pitch perfectly in both style and storytelling.
Don't mind us, just robbing this place.
Using anthropomorphic animal characters, it's able to be incredibly creative with its humor as well as how it portrays its themes. The characters in this film are also really charming and lovable, and in some cases, like with Wolf, Diane, and Snake, multi-layered. You also have to praise the action and especially the car chases in this film, which are just an incredible spectacle that pushes the already highly stylized animation to its limits. All in all, there really isn't much to dislike in this film, save for one or two story elements maybe being a bit rushed, plus the occasional fart joke. Still, it's really no wonder that so many fell in love with this film, seeing it as a return to form for DreamWorks. Finally, we had DreamWorks' S-tier movies, the cream of the crop in terms of stories, humor, and animation, and the ones that are considered legendary by animation fans everywhere. Starting things off in the S tier is the hit sequel How to Train Your Dragon 2. We know, for some Dragons fans out there, this one is their favorite and the one they consider to be the best in the franchise. But while we can't go that far, we can't pretend that it isn't still a spectacle movie that does a great job building on the strengths of the original, allowing it to feel fresh instead of like just a rehash. The emotions that come with the introduction of Valka and the death of Stoic alongside the growing bond between Hiccup and Toothless do their job incredibly well, and the action and flying sequences that the franchise was known for at this point were also just as good as ever. Many have also praised the film for not playing it safe and being willing to be a bit darker than the first, even if there were still some comedy relief bits, mostly from Hiccup's human friends. Which not everyone appreciated. It's also been said that Drago isn't all that interesting of a villain, even if he does provide the film with a decent threat. Overall though, How to Train Your Dragon 2 is a movie that barely ever falters and is easily seen as one of the strongest installments that the studio has ever produced. Similarly, Kung Fu Panda 2 is also seen as one of DreamWorks' best sequels. It's hard to really forget about a film that openly talks about topics like genocide, though thankfully Kung Fu Panda 2 never feels too dark nor dour, even with these more serious and dramatic moments. It's a film that still has plenty of fun parts to it, introducing new characters that have become fan favorites and creating a story that's both poignant and heartwarming for the audience. It's great not only seeing Po continue to grow as a Kung Fu master, but also come to terms with his past, allowing him to move forward alongside his friends and adoptive father. The action and stylization of the film also managed to be top-notch, with Poe's inner peace water droplet demonstration and the sequence where we see him redirect Shen's cannonballs back at him being the film's highlights. Speaking of Shen, some fans consider him to be both the best Kung Fu Panda villain and one of DreamWorks' best villains, period.
I'm so glad you feel that way.
Being a villain that's simultaneously comedic, tragic, and all-around despicable when it comes to his willingness to do horrific acts of evil. Again, it's a film that has perfect balance when it comes to its comedic and dramatic elements, and while it may drag somewhat in its second act, the highs it manages to reach are ones that many haven't yet, and likely won't ever forget. But enough about dragons and kung fu, let's talk about superheroes, because here is where we find Megamind. Talk about a film ahead of its time.
Hello?
While a bit of a flop when it first came out, many people these days are turning to Megamind as a great example of both genre commentary and genre subversion that can still stand on its own as an overall enjoyable story. Though perhaps a bit on the nose with some of the characters' monologues, it's still an incredibly fun and clever film that'll make you laugh just as much as it'll make you reflect on the superhero tropes you already know so well. Speaking of the characters, this film probably contains one of the studio's most likable protagonists in Megamind, who's that great blend of egotistical yet sympathetic.
You always know what to say.
As familiar as some elements of this movie may be, it's one that manages to keep audience members on their toes through its clever storytelling, hilarious jokes, and themes that still resonate with many, regardless of whether or not they like the superhero genre in the first place. Just outside of the top 5, we finally arrived at the original Shrek. A true game changer for animation, we couldn't not put the first Shrek in S tier. While it could be argued that there's one better Shrek installment, you have to respect the original for breaking the mold. While its story could be stronger and its humor, while still really good and really memorable, could maybe be a bit less reliant on gross out humor, it's the characters that truly help this movie shine. The relationship between Shrek, Donkey, and Fiona feels genuine, with the romance especially being really charming to see play out, and is the true core of the film, making you connect with each of the characters and their arcs. The film also plays on fairy tale tropes well, knowing when to subvert them and when to lean into them, and it's kind of amazing how well the animation still holds up after nearly 3 decades. Shrek is a movie that deserves all the praise it gets, and really is a classic all-star through and through. Moving along, it should be no surprise to see the original How to Train Your Dragon so high up in S tier. It's a classic story about a boy and his dragon, and for as much as it may be fairly simple when it comes to its plot and its characters, the way it presents these elements in such a heartfelt and grandiose way truly makes up for any of the film's shortcomings. The bond between Hiccup and Toothless has become iconic in its own right, as have those amazing flying sequences. Even the more cliche elements, like the romance between Hiccup and Astrid, or the struggles Hiccup has in trying to connect with his father, still fit the story well, and thus are able to be enjoyed despite their familiar elements. In a word, this film almost feels magical in how it all comes together perfectly, taking audiences along for an incredible ride. Next up, does someone need a hero? It's time for Shrek 2. Yeah, speaking of iconic, this film really is just a ton of fun from beginning to end. Everything from the story and the jokes to the romance and themes, it all just feels like it's been taken to the next level when compared to the first film. Admittedly, Fiona does get kind of shafted in that she doesn't get to do much in the story, though we appreciate her getting to be the one to make the final choice regarding whether or not she and Shrek will stay human. That line about her wanting to live happily ever after with the ogre she married, just chef's kiss.
Whatever happens, I must not cry.
Additionally, for as much as it expands on the old characters, the film also introduces some great new characters in Puss and Fairy Godmother, plus it has some incredibly fun and memorable action sequences, including probably one of the best climaxes to come out of this studio. There's very little to actually dislike about this film, as it all works incredibly well in how it both expands the Shrek universe and reminds us what we loved about Shrek in the first place. It's just a fun time that we'd be happy to enjoy over and over again. Following it, we have the original Kung Fu Panda. DreamWorks is known for its silly and absurd stories, but who would have guessed that a film about a panda learning Kung Fu would turn out to be so poignant and have such strong themes to it? Both Po and Shifu's respective arcs are done perfectly throughout the film, as they both grow and, in turn, help each other grow. Tai Lung is also an incredibly interesting villain, in addition to serving as the perfect threat for Po to face for his first big fight. While other Kung Fu Panda installments and even other DreamWorks films keep the bar high, there's no denying that this first Kung Fu Panda film has some of the most fantastic action sequences ever animated. Tai Lung's prison escape, his confrontation with Shifu, the bridge scene, and the film's final fight are all done exceptionally well. But above all else, we have to appreciate this film for how it presents its many lessons and themes, all of which being things that both kids and adults can reflect on and learn from.
You are too concerned with what was and what will be.
It may still be a bit silly at times, but that doesn't take away from just how dramatic and all-around awesome this movie can be, and frankly is. In terms of DreamWorks sequels, we can't imagine too many fans would disagree with putting Puss in Boots: The Last Wish at the very top. top. We're still not sure how DreamWorks managed to pull this one off, but we're certainly grateful for it, as The Last Wish manages to stand out as both an incredible follow-up film that ties wonderfully into its franchise, as well as just a great film in general that someone could easily watch and still appreciate without watching any of the other Shrek films or even the first Puss in Boots film. That right there tells you how good this movie is at both its characterization of its main cast and its storytelling overall. It plays into the classic fairy tale tropes wonderfully while still adding its own bit of unique flair, while its themes of living life to the fullest and appreciating what you have could bring a tear to anyone's eye. Its art and animation, being reminiscent of a painted illustration, is truly a sight to behold, and with a fun trio leading the way and 3 different types of antagonists pushing along the film's conflict, there's something here that pretty much anyone and everyone could enjoy. We feel this movie deserves all the praise in the world for what it managed to accomplish, and we hope the next Shrek film can follow in its footsteps. Or should we say bootsteps? However, the title of overall best DreamWorks film has to go to The Prince of Egypt. Seen as one of DreamWorks' masterpieces and one of the greatest animated films of all time, we just have to respect all the ambition that went into making a film like this, not to mention how daring it was to do as one of the studio's earliest films. While there may be some lighthearted and even slightly goofy elements to it, namely in the first third or so, the film doesn't shy away from more dramatic and dark elements of the story, definitely not shying away from the more complex story elements and managing to portray the tragedy of it in an overall respectful manner. Its animation is beautiful and absolutely stunning in some scenes, impeccably capturing both wonder and horror depending on the sequence, and while you may not get as much out of it if you're not religious, there are still plenty of elements within the film that anyone can still appreciate. While it may not be at the top of every DreamWorks fan's list, and that's fine, there's no denying that The Prince of Egypt is truly an S-tier film and how it achieves everything you could ask it to when taking on a story as epic and culturally important as this one.
Crushed, blown up, obliterated, eaten alive, consumed by the depths of the sea, dragged into the darkness by nightmares, banished to the spirit realm.
Just some of the magical fates DreamWorks Animation has brought to us. Today we're ranking every single DreamWorks Animation villain fate from least gruesome to most gruesome. Our last, or technically first place pick for the least gruesome DreamWorks fate has to be Eris from Sinbad, Legend of the Seven Seas. With some villains, it often feels like they got away with their crimes. Like, they committed genuine acts of terrorism and got hit with the equivalent of a slap on the wrist in return. Eris is a different case, however, because in her case, that's basically exactly what happened.
And lucky for you, I've got places to go, things to destroy, stuff to steal.
I guess it wouldn't be too easy to punish a goddess of chaos, but there's something morbidly funny about seeing a character pretty much blatantly admit that she's learned absolutely nothing, that she's going to continue committing the exact same crimes she committed throughout the movie, more in the future, and still facing absolutely no retribution for it.
Well, Peter, I guess you learned a pretty valuable lesson.
Nope. Barely behind in our next spot is Chunky from The Croods. The attempted murderer to pet pipeline is a crucial part of the DreamWorks lore, and Chunky's a perfect example of this. When the third act conflict forces him and Grug to work together in order to avoid extinction, they end up going from enemies to friends in record time. Since he gained new companions through his misdeeds, you could almost say that Chunky got an even better ending than Eris, but we're gonna put him lower than her on the sole basis that he actually deserved his scot-free ending, whereas Eris really didn't. On a similar note is Queen Barb from Trolls World Tour. Queen Barb got a pretty merciful redemption given how she literally tried to take over the entire world with music. Her vision was basically a worldwide cultural assimilation. In other words, she wanted to unite the world forcibly under a love of rock music.
I will unite the trolls under one music. Our music!
This is definitely one of the more ambitious schemes from a DreamWorks film, so it says a lot that she basically got off with a slap on the wrist, changing for the better after the film, and even becoming friends with Poppy and the other trolls. The whole power of friendship tone fits well with the Trolls universe, but Barb's still got dealt an easy hand. Rounding out the bottom category is Don Lino from the infamous Shark Tale. Love it or hate it, I think there's one thing everyone can agree on when it comes to Shark Tale. Don Lino is not that bad of a guy. I mean, sure, he's a widely feared mob boss who eats weaker sea creatures.
I want to know everything about him. I want to know where he lives. I want to know where he sleeps. He pops a gill. I want to know about it. Who is the Shark Slayer?
Okay, look, I said he's not that bad. If nothing else, he does genuinely love his family.
I don't know how else to say this to you, Lenny. You see something, you kill it, you eat it. Period. Thanks.
Even if he looks down on Lenny for being a vegetarian, the ending of the movie sees him apologize to his son, accepting him for who he is. The worst thing that happened to him was getting beaten up indirectly by the car wash, and also having his face nibbled for a few minutes by some vengeful shrimp. The only reason Don Lino's even this low is that while it wasn't part of a punishment, per se. He did have to face the loss of his beloved son Frankie, but in the end he made a lot of friends and learned a valuable lesson. Honestly, you could argue he had a better arc than Oscar, but I guess that's a discussion for another day. For now, let's move on to the characters who at least kinda paid for their misdeeds. These are the villains who got technically punished. First up in this category is former Captain Smek from Home. The Boov are known as an alien race who specialize in running away from their problems.
Genius! They will never find us here. Thank you!
God, that's a mood. And as obnoxious as he is, so is Captain Smek, their once beloved leader. Or rather, their still beloved former leader. Sure, Smek got dethroned by Kyle when he was outed as a coward, unwilling to face the people's problems, which is admittedly weird since he was super open about being said coward, but whatever. But at the end of the movie, he's shown partying on the moon with the other Boov. It was initially hard for him to accept no longer being a captain, but he's still beloved enough to throw a party on the moon with a pretty big group of his people. So in the end, I guess he learned his lesson, or at least learned how to DJ.
Yes! I love it!
Good for him either way. Up next is Guy Gagné from Turbo. Gagné is basically a less successful Chick Hicks. He was a once beloved racer and the idol of Turbo, that is, before he revealed that he'd go to any lengths to crush his competition. He was capable of endangering the lives of not just Turbo, but the other more human racers just to ensure that he wouldn't have to be known as the guy who lost to a snail at the Indy 500. In the end, he was both known as the guy who lost to a snail at the Indy 500 and the guy who got banned from racing and presumably arrested for all the damage he caused. Professor Poopy Pants from Captain Underpants is up next. Okay, so did nobody tell this guy about name changes?
Not exactly.
Like, I'm sorry to break my suspension of disbelief so soon, but come on, the guy's smart enough to invent a machine that can literally delete a child's ability to laugh, rich enough to actually build it, and he didn't once think to change his name until George and Harold suggested it to him. It's actually really funny. This guy should be a comedian.
Sir, are you saying your full name is Pee-Pee Diarrheastein Poopy Pants Esquire?
Uh-huh.
That is, if he ever grows back to normal size after being shrunken down to a tiny enough size to ride a bee. It's certainly an adjustment, but I have a feeling he'll find some kind of invention that's capable of fixing his woes.
Back in business, baby!
Either way, he lobotomized children and didn't get a life sentence for it, which, any way you slice it, is a pretty easy fate for him to accept. Next is the youngest villain on our list, Francis E. Francis. Fittingly, the man who tried to capitalize on society's love of all things cute was punished by being turned into something cute himself, a helpless little baby. Okay, maybe not little, but definitely helpless. On one hand, sure, it must be hard to accept that you're gonna have to be raised from infancy all over again. On the other hand, well, babies are known for getting literally everything they want handed to them. Whether he still has the mind of his adult self or not, that's a pretty sweet deal. And if Eugene sticks to his word, hopefully Francis will be a better grown-up once they finish re-raising him. Rounding out this category are the Fossa from Madagascar. These guys aren't the most evil villains on our list by any means, but in the context of their movie, they're definitely some of the scariest. The Fossa have been tormenting lemurs for ages, to the point where the mere mention of them sends the whole clan into a panic. Thankfully, when Alex overcomes his predator instincts and uses his strengths to intimidate them, the Fossa are forced to run away and never hunt lemurs again. It might sound like a pretty easy deal, but think about it. The Fossa are going to have to try and find an entirely new source of food now that the lemurs are off limits. What's worse is that they now have something hunting them, or at least someone they think is hunting them. It's good that they'll be kept in check, but it won't be an easy adjustment for the poor guys. That said, it'll be easier than for anyone else down the line. These are the non-lethal fates. They might not be dead, but they still got some pretty substantial punishment. First and foremost, we can't go without mentioning the most tragic villain in DreamWorks history, Ken from B-Movie. Look, I get it. The guy has a bit of a temper and isn't the most pleasant dude to be around, but like, come on. The guy's allergic to bees, so he tries to kill a bee that made it into his house.
Well, a royal flush!
To a normal person, that sounds completely rational. To Vanessa, it's an absolute deal breaker.
Are there other bugs in your life?
No, but there are other things bugging me in life.
This man not only lost his girlfriend to a literal bee, he has to live with the fact that they have a freaking law firm together. That's a level of disrespect I didn't even know existed, all going to a guy who did nothing to deserve it. Justice for Ken.
Oh, that bee is living my life!
Let it go, Kenny.
When will this nightmare end?
Swimming into the next spot is Chelsea Van Der Zee, a local teenage mermaid who's totally not an ageless war criminal trying to get revenge on Ruby's mother. Normally, for a sea monster, a fate of being caged by a guy who's devoted seemingly decades to catching creatures like you would be a fate worse than death, but Ruby doesn't seem to mind. She survived getting hit by 3 Kraken lasers with nothing but the trident to block her, seeing as how she seems to have sustained 0 injuries, and if that weren't merciful enough, she's absolutely eating up the attention of being live streamed with Captain Lighthouse.
I'm not evil. I'm just pretty and misunderstood. understood.
She definitely could have gotten a way worse ending, but honestly, something about this just seems right. Taking home a similar fate is the former pop star duo of Velvet and Veneer. This dastardly duo from Trolls band together had a pretty messed up plan. Lacking anything adjacent to musical talent themselves, they took Trolls captive and sucked the life, i.e. talent, out of them to enhance their performances. Being guilty of terrorism, kidnapping, and torture, they've definitely more than earned that prison sentence they got in the end.
Fair enough. Prison it is!
But honestly, mad respect to Veneer for having the guts to publicly admit his crimes and accept his punishment. Finally, a celebrity who can take some accountability. One of the slightly more ambiguous fates, that of Makunga, is next. In case you forgot about this Alec Baldwin persona, Makunga is the main villain of Madagascar 2, scheming to become the alpha of Zuba's pride.
But after I defeat you and take over as Alpha Lion, you'll have so much more time to spend with your pathetic excuse of a son.
He also plotted to get the pair straight up killed to decomplicate things a bit, which led ultimately to a well-deserved beating from Nana, who called this self-proclaimed alpha what he really is, a bad kitty. The last we see of Makunga is him being pulled away by his ear, and apparently the DVD commentary for Madagascar 2 reveals that he was taken back to New York in a cage by Nana. Whether this is as a pet, or a donation to the zoo, or some other third thing is anyone's guess, but whether or not that one guy in the Reddit comment section who suggested she might have eaten him is correct, I'll just go off of what we know and keep him relatively low as a result. Clay-figured gold digger Victor is up next. This pretentious, putty person wants to marry Lady Tottington in order to get a share of her massive estate.
What ho! For you, my love.
This results in him attempting to murder Wallace, who Tottington actually likes, and that results in a whole slew of consequences.
Get your hairy mitts off my future wife, you big brute.
He gets sprayed in the face by pansy spray, how subtle, and knocked unconscious by his would-be wifey. That, furthermore, results in Gromit disguising Victor himself as the were-rabbit, which earns him a well-deserved beating from the townsfolk. It's unknown what happened to him from then on out, but hopefully he's learned a valuable lesson about respecting women, and not killing people too, I guess. Rumpelstiltskin from Shrek Forever After is up next. He's one of Shrek's more calculating adversaries from the series, using his magical contracts to make deals that essentially give him whatever he wants. Most notably, a deal to take one single day from Shrek's life results in a butterfly effect that ultimately ends in Rumpelstiltskin taking over the kingdom of Far, Far Away. Despite Rumpelstiltskin coming extremely close to achieving his goals, Shrek and Fiona's kiss of true love breaks the contract, and ultimately nothing is known of Rumpel's fate except for the fact that he's behind bars. Next we have another ambiguous fate, that of Miss Grunion from Mr. Peabody and Sherman. Her attempts to get Sherman out of the custody of a talking dog probably wouldn't result in a huge legal punishment, but she gets karma in a more unique way, getting involuntarily sucked up by a time rift and sent to a group of Trojan soldiers.
Come here, soldier.
She might technically have her freedom to some degree, but think about it, everything and everyone Grunion knows is now literally decades away from her, and she has no clear way to reunite with them. It's a pretty rough punishment, and it's only gonna get worse from here. There is no Easter Bunny, there is no Tooth Fairy, and there is no way we can place Titan from Megamind any lower. Just kidding, by the way, I met the Easter Bunny one time. He's chill. Titan could learn a thing or two from him, really.
I usually just scare criminals. You haven't been naughty, have you?
Perhaps the most iconic incel villain in cinematic history, Titan responds to his rejection by Roxanne in the worst possible way by using his powers to become a supervillain rather than a hero.
It's supposed to be with me!
Proving himself as a mentally unstable man-child, Titan ultimately gets defeated by Megamind, losing the powers he was having so much fun with and, ironically, being sent to the same prison Megamind himself was in. Still, despite him being in jail for what I can only imagine is several decades, if not life, he's still happy enough to dance with some pretty sick moves. Get it, Hal, you depraved man-child, you? Up next, we have Chantal Dubois from Madagascar 3, Europe's Most Wanted. This Monegasque animal control captain is known as the most dangerous exterminator in the country, and that's probably because her second favorite hobby, next to killing animals, is collecting. What does she collect, you may ask? Take a wild guess. In any case, her sadistic streak is stopped by the animals. After Mort shoots her with a tranquilizer dart, the others take the opportunity to trap her in a crate and ship her and her men to Madagascar. She's about to be in full-on survival mode, but at the very least, she has her allies with her, so while she'll be struggling, she won't be struggling alone. Unless they turn on her, that is, which, no, I didn't really think about that. From an animal hunter to an actual animal, Professor Marmalade is up next. Marmalade is a two-faced guinea pig who prided himself on being seen as the most altruistic creature in the known world. In actuality, he was a scheming villain who planned one of the most devious heists in history, raising millions of dollars to give to various charities, only to brainwash countless other guinea pigs to steal it just as it arrived. He's a truly messed up guy, which is why I can't say I feel bad for his end. In fact, it's probably one of the most satisfying endings on the whole list. His mansion, with all his possessions he took so much pride in, was blown up before his very eyes, and thanks to Diane's cleverness, he was framed for the theft of a jewel and presumably a bunch of other crimes too. Considering his big villain reveal was during his scheme to falsely accuse the bad guys of his own crimes, it's poetic that he got arrested for someone else's crimes rather than his own, not to mention completely losing all of his public favor. It's truly an unbearable punishment for him. Speaking of bears, next is Vincent from Over the Hedge. Honestly, the fact that Vincent even survived is nothing short of a miracle. With Hammy's help, Vincent is restrained and hit by the D-Pelter Turbo, a government-banned weapon that fires a laser strong enough to destroy a satellite in outer space.
The D-Pelter Turbo. Prepare for a lot of stinging.
He may have somehow survived that, but given how long the blast was, it's safe to say he endured a lot of pain, not to mention hair loss. We'd place him lower, but he was released into the Rockies after the events of the movie, which will give him a fresh start, and hopefully a valuable lesson about not bullying. Nearing the end of this section is a dual entry, Jack and Jill from Puss in Boots. They might have survived a stomp from the Great Terror, which admittedly is pretty darn lucky, but they were injured enough to be placed in full body casts, which means they'll be in pain and out of commission for a long while. And to think, now their little pig babies are gonna have to care for their own parents. Kids really are the ones who suffer the most in these situations. There is a case to be made that Zek-El Khan didn't survive, even though we never saw him die. When he leads Cortez to a newly closed entrance to the City of Gold, Cortez assumes he was lying, and that furthermore results in, they never showed it.
You lying heathen. There's nothing here at all.
Well, knowing what we do about Cortez being a ruthless pirate and all, we can only assume that Zek-El Khan was either murdered or enslaved by Cortez, neither of which sound like a very happy ending for him. Next is the newest Dreamworks villain, Vantra, from The Wild Robot. Usually the term crushed in a context like this lists would indicate a character dying instantly by something big falling on them. For Vantra, though, it's more of a soda can type of crushing. Using her own ship's tractor beam against her, Roz manages to get Vantra crushed by the forces of gravity itself.
We will just keep.
Granted, Vantra is a robot, so it's not unreasonable to assume that she could be repaired or at least have her consciousness transferred over to something else. Another benefit of being a robot is the fact that she doesn't feel physical pain, which is great for her here. All she's going to have to deal with is the fact that she failed her mission, which, knowing what we humans tend to do with faulty technology, is probably still not going to end super well for her. It might seem strange to place Mrs. Tweety from Chicken Run here in the non-lethal area of our list. While it may not be a sudden explosion, Tweety had one of the most cartoonishly over-the-top deaths we've looked at so far. She smacks face first into a billboard, falls into a pot of presumably boiling gravy, and even gets crushed by a door from which we don't see her bounce back.
I told you they was organized.
If she did survive this, she's gonna have some serious burns and injuries that'll torment her for a while. And as of the sequel, Dawn of the Nugget, it's confirmed that she did, in fact, survive. Not only that, she remarried and started a new, even more ruthless chicken business, because that's possible, proving that she didn't learn anything adjacent to a lesson from the first movie. As a result, she got an even more cartoonish fake-out death, being shot with a robot duck's laser and once again being right at the center of a factory-wide explosion. Of course, the director confirmed that she did, in fact, survive again, meaning that she had to deal with those severe, albeit deserved, near-fatal injuries twice. Rounding out the non-lethal fates is the Toad from Flushed Away. Despite a sympathetic backstory, the Toad loses any sympathy we would have had for him by engaging in an attempted genocide against all rats.
Perhaps you forget that it was a rat who cast me from paradise.
Oh, please, not the scrapbook again.
I guess we should be glad he didn't target humanity since they're the ones who flushed him in the first place. Thankfully, either way, his plan wasn't successful. Roddy managed to trick him into getting his tongue stuck in a spinning gear, leaving him stuck there for who knows how long. This leads to a situation where Toad has absolutely no hope of escape. While his cousin, Le Frog, managed to get away relatively unharmed, it's confirmed that the Toad was arrested for his crimes and an essential guide companion to the movie. Judging by the fact that his crimes were the attempted genocide of an entire species, I don't think he's gonna be seeing the light of day anytime soon. But the remaining villains saw a different kind of light, and they went towards it for better or for worse. These are the quick deaths. One of our few truly redeemed villains today, Humpty Alexander Dumpty, is next. While old Huevo here committed some pretty horrible crimes against his blood brother and his old town as a whole,
Okay, I got everything. We did it. Come on, let's go!
he ultimately managed to redeem himself by helping return the golden goose to its mother, the Great Terror. When Puss can only pull Humpty or the goose up, he refuses to let Humpty go, so Puss's old friend does what he does best, and has a great fall.
Puss, you have to save the baby or the mama will destroy San Ricardo.
Jokes aside, it was actually a pretty sad scene, but he looks truly at peace in the end, and it was his own choice to die for the sake of others. He definitely did redeem himself in the end, so if anyone had a peaceful death here, I'm glad it was Humpty. Next is another villain who could find redemption, Tai Lung from Kung Fu Panda. Sent to the spirit realm by the infamous Wuxi Fingerhold, Tai Lung died with an expression of horror as he was finally forced to accept defeat at the hands of the true Dragon Warrior. It may not have been a particularly painful death, or at the very least not a super long one, but Tai Lung is going to spend eternity in the spirit realm stewing on his defeat. Still, in Kung Fu Panda 4, he seems to have found some sense of peace, even accepting Po as a dragon warrior and showing that he might have some capacity for redemption.
Maybe Oogway was right about you.
It seems like Tai Lung learned his lesson, giving him one of the easier to swallow ends in Dreamworks' villainous lineup. A much less deserved instantaneous death was that of Fairy Godmother from Shrek 2. When she needed a hero most, none showed up, except for Harold, who was a hero to his family. But the worst nightmare of Fairy Godmother, by reflecting her magic right back at her, Harold gave Fairy Godmother a truly gruesome fate, being turned into bubbles. Yeah, jokes aside, this really is one of the easier fatal endings for a Dreamworks villain. I guess if the bubbles could feel pain, that kinda changes it, seeing as how she'd be popping by multiple tiny explosions, but it seemed pretty instantaneous to me, so really, I can't honestly say she deserves to be any lower. General Mandible from Ants is up next. Hailing from Dreamworks' least kid-friendly film, you might expect General Mandible to have one of the more gruesome deaths on our list, but ironically, it was one of the most basic. The guy fell to his doom and died on impact.
I believe history will see things differently.
Unlike with Humpty, it wasn't his own decision to die, and there was nothing mistakable for peace on that face of his, unfortunately for him. Prince Charming has made it pretty low on our list, and that's because he's the first villain here to get crushed to death. This narcissistic nobleman came pretty close to his happy ending, plotting to kill Shrek for revenge in front of an audience of admirers.
A new era finally begins!
His plot to slay the ogre was foiled, however, when he was crushed by a stone tower. You know, the stone tower that was literally part of the set he made for his big show.
This was supposed to be my happily ever after!
If it's any consolation, Charming, it was a grand finale. You may have died, but at least you looked fabulous while doing it, right? Rounding out this category is the coldest death on our list, Dr. Zara from Abominable. Falling to your death or getting crushed to death are both pretty brutal concepts, even if they are instantaneous. But there are basically three ways to interpret this one. A, Zara died from being crushed by a massive pile of snow. Then there's option B, that she actually died from the fall itself, either of which would mean the last moments of her life were full of sheer horror. The worst, though, is C, that she survived the fall and the crushing due to her snowmobile's strong build, but honestly that would make this one even rougher. While it was probably an instant death, the thought that she could have starved or frozen to death is still pretty brutal. But ironically, it's the last entry before we get to the category for particularly gruesome ends, which we'll call the brutal deaths. First up is the wannabe alpha of the dragons, Drago Bloodfist. The villain of How to Train Your Dragon 2 is a great foil to Hiccup. Instead of adopting dragons as friends and steeds, Drago is a ruthless brute who plans to use their strength to conquer the world, undeniably one of Dreamworks' most dangerous villains.
You belong to me now.
While his death didn't occur on screen, Drago still came painfully close to achieving his goal, only for Toothless's power to override that of his own dragon, sending the both of them to the depths of the sea. While it's not entirely impossible that he could have escaped, to be dragged to his more than likely doom by the very creature who brought him near victory must have felt like a pretty painful loss. I mean, it was a deserved painful loss, but still. On a very similar note is the next dragon's villain, Grimmel the Grizzly. Like Drago, Grimmel got sent to his doom at the bottom of the sea. Unlike him, however, there's much less room for doubt that he died. If he didn't die from the impact, which is the more likely scenario given the height he fell from, he would have certainly drowned, being too injured to swim to safety. Tack on the sheer terror in his eyes and you have a pretty rough end. Next we have another villain who came close to his goals, Shen from Kung Fu Panda 2. When a prophecy foretold that Shen's end would come from a warrior of black and white, he did the only reasonable thing, murdering every panda in the world, becoming a genocidal war criminal and one of Dreamworks' most evil villains by a long shot.
Such sad, sad faces.
In a true twist of irony, Shen was crushed by the very cannon he was going to use to blow up Po, and even if he'd survived that, the explosion of the fireworks right afterwards would finish the job for sure. On the topic of explosions, next is Jack Horner from Puss in Boots: The Last Wish. Jack Horner was a man who was evil and proud of it. His entire goal was to use the wishing star to take all the magic in the world for himself, and only himself. Which is why his death at the very same wishing star is a beautifully ironic twist.
Goodbye.
Despite coming pretty close to achieving his goal, he was knocked into the exploding wishing star and died wondering what specifically he did to deserve this.
Oh, what a good boy am I.
Knowing Jack, I'm sure he's blown up more than his fair share of people, so it makes sense that he'd wonder which event necessitated such a gruesome end. And we'll talk about just one more explosion for now, Galaxar from Monsters vs. Aliens. Getting stuck on a ship that's self-destructing is one of those fates where they really don't need to spell out whether or not the bad guy survived.
Nothing happened. Maybe my count...
Sure, being in the escape pod could have given Galaxar a sort of shield from the worst of it, but that actually just makes this even more gruesome. His death would have been prolonged even more if the escape pod's armor helped prevent injuries, or it could have intensified the heat and pressure from the explosion. Who knows? In any case, if getting blown up is the best case scenario, you've got a pretty brutal end to consider. Up next, we have the chef from Trolls. We've seen a lot of ironic deaths today, but the chef takes the cake of those. It's fitting that the villain whose whole goal was to eat a troll ended up getting eaten by a much bigger creature herself. Not only does getting digested sound like an absolutely horrific way to go, there's also the little detail that Creek, who was eaten by the same hill monster, somehow survived, seeing as how he's brought back in the Beast Goes On cartoon series. Being digested is bad enough, but imagine having to get digested and deal with the trauma of it afterwards. Still, at least she only got eaten once. That's more than we can say for one of DreamWorks' most iconic villains, Lord Farquaad.
The ogre has fallen in love with the princess. Oh, good lord.
When he makes the mistake of getting in between Shrek and Fiona's romance, he finds himself on the wrong side of a hungry dragon's belly. That's bad enough, not to mention the fact that he was quite literally moments away from becoming the king he wanted to be. But then you take Shrek 4D into account, where Farquaad's ghost seeks revenge on Shrek and a post-mortem marriage with Fiona.
Soon you and I will be together forever.
Ironically, he meets his end by once again getting eaten by a dragon. I didn't know that even cartoon logic allowed ghosts to be eaten, but I guess Pac-Man has some competition. Before we move into our final category, let's talk about a couple more explosions, like that of Kai from Kung Fu Panda 3. During his climactic final battle with Po, the latter decides the only way to destroy this chi-hungry madman is to give him exactly what he wants. All the chi that Po can harness, which proves to be far too much for Kai to handle.
No, it's too much. That's too much. No!
While plenty of characters today were brought painfully close to victory only to have it snatched right away, Kai literally got the power he was searching for, only for that same power to blow him up from the inside. There's only one explosion I can call worse, and that's the demise of Red Death from How to Train Your Dragon. He's more gray than red, isn't he? Well, whether he's red or not, he's definitely dead. Toothless hit him with a fireball to the throat, which blew up his body from the inside via a series of brutal explosions. With how massive Red Death was, those explosions must have taken a while to fully destroy him, but I doubt they hurt any less as a result. Now, believe it or not, Red Death is the last full-on death on our list. But believe you me, these last four are the ones with fates worse than death, and I have a feeling they'll be jealous of Red Death pretty soon. She may be the least popular of the series' villains, but the Chameleon from Kung Fu Panda 4 got the most brutal ending by far. I guess technically the Chameleon kinda died, but rather than being sent right to the spirit realm like Tai Lung, blown up in the spirit realm like Kai, or even blown up plain and simple like Shen, the Chameleon was simply defeated by Po and Zhen. After that, she lost all the power she worked to obtain, which was apparently quite a lot of power. She ended up dragged kicking and screaming into the spirit realm by Tai Lung, surrounded by all the other masters whose power she used against Po.
Shen, do something!
While we don't see any more of her afterwards, I don't think Tai Lung has a welcome party ready for her. Or maybe he does, who am I to assume? The Bronze Medal of Brutality goes to Dave from the Penguins of Madagascar movie. After all the brutal things we've seen today, getting trapped in a snow globe probably sounds like a pretty light punishment. What? But even if we ignore how close Dave came to victory, his fate of being shrunken down and trapped in a snow globe means that he not only stays in a cramped space for as long as the globe stands, he experiences straight up earthquakes whenever his child owner shakes him. We would place him lower, but it's entirely possible that the kid could drop the snow globe by accident, which would result in Dave being free again.
Burning thirst for revenge!
But with how tiny he is now, I doubt he'll be much trouble regardless. It's time for us to let our viewers go. To the Silver Medal of Brutality, King Ramses II. The Prince of Egypt is one of DreamWorks' first films, and arguably one of its best, acting as a beautiful retelling of the biblical story of the Exodus. This includes the defeat of the Pharaoh at the hands of the 10 plagues sent by God through his brother. All these plagues were pretty rough, but the worst was definitely the 10th and final one, during which Ramses lost his son, forced to grapple with the fact that his pride resulted in the death of his beloved child.
Leave me!
As if that weren't harrowing enough, he makes a last-ditch effort to come out on top by sending his army after Moses, which resulted in the parted Red Sea crashing down on them, drowning all the Pharaoh's army in the process. Ramses lost quite literally everything that mattered to him, forced to sit on his lonesome throne forever, knowing that his brother is gone, his son is dead, and his army was crushed by his own word. It's hard to think of a worse way to go. But at the very least, Ramses' suffering at least ended at some point. Pitch Black from Rise of the Guardians earns our top spot for that sole reason. It's fitting that the monster who wanted to plunge the world into eternal darkness and terror ended up with the exact fate he'd hoped to force onto others. At his defeat, Pitch Black is dragged away by pure nightmares, and while he assures the Guardians that he'll be back, something about his hopeless, terrified screams tells me that that's more than a little bit unlikely.
Finally!
Someone who knows how to have a little fun.
Pitch Black basically got sentenced to psychological hell with little to no hope of escaping, and with him being immortal, there's no way his suffering will end any way you slice it. He failed at his goal, he's tormented by his fears, and he can't even beg for the sweet release of death to overcome it. Man, this guy is really in the same category as a jealous purple octopus. Let that sink in.
Beheaded with a hatchet, murdered by soldiers, eaten alive by sharks, eaten alive by gators, blown up, ripped apart, and thrown into a river.
This is your body, and this is your body in a Dreamworks film. We already talked about the villains' deaths, so today we're ranking Dreamworks non-main villains' deaths gruesome to most disturbing. We'll begin with those characters whose deaths were greatly exaggerated, if you will.
My death was greatly exaggerated.
These are the temporary deaths, and no, we aren't counting Metro Man. He just happened to have the perfect line to kick things off. While some would argue that this one wasn't canon, we're giving Creek from Trolls the lowest spot on our list. Now, in Creek's defense, his very, very limited defense, he, like the other Trolls, went through a lot in this movie. He was savored by Gristle throughout the film, and the literal only thing he was able to do to save his own skin was to betray his own people to the Bergens, with seemingly no remorse at all, granted.
At least you get to die with a clear conscience.
While his decision was at least understandable, it still isn't good by any means, which is why we definitely can't say we felt sorry for him being eaten by a hill monster. Still, unlike the chef, Creek at least had a somewhat sympathetic reason, so as bad as his decision to betray his people was, giving him another chance in the Beat Goes On spin-off series was a nice choice. Yeah, it's revealed that Creek somehow survived being eaten by the hill monster, and while I'm absolutely certain that wasn't a pleasant experience, the fact that Creek not only cheated death, but was ultimately welcomed back by the friends he turned on shows that the universe was feeling very merciful to him. I guess every troll deserves a second chance, even if he owes them a lot of apology songs. Already rounding out this category, we have the Sandman from Rise of the Guardians. Sandy was always one of the most powerful Guardians in the movie, with the power to give sleep and sweet dreams to the children of the world. This also made him a particularly high priority target for Pitch Black, whose whole goal was to shroud the entire world in darkness and nightmares. Despite an epic battle, Sandman is distracted enough by Pitch's army to be defeated by a single arrow to the back, turning him into a nightmare and forcing him to go against his old friends. That's a pretty brutal way to go, even if he does peacefully succumb to it, almost as if to say, you know what? Nah, you guys got this. And thankfully, they did got this, because Sandman is not only restored to his former glory, but he's the one who ultimately takes Pitch down. An encouraging sign to never give up, not even when you're dead. With that, let's move on to the characters who weren't lucky enough to get a full-on second chance. These characters passed due to natural causes. Master Oogway is first up in this category. Thankfully for him, the Kung Fu Panda series has plenty of spirit realm stuff involved with it, so while Oogway does pass away in the first movie, it doesn't stop him from playing a big role via both flashbacks and post-mortem advice to Poe. And while it might have to do entirely with just how unbelievably chill Oogway is, it's also worth noting that he was completely unfazed by his own death.
My time has come.
Simply passing his staff to Master Shifu and peacefully moving on to the other side. Even death itself wasn't cruel enough to give Oogway anything but a peaceful end, and I appreciate that personally. While we don't have a lot of information on the deaths of Yi's father, that in itself indicates that his death was probably normal. There's no mention of foul play or anything like that.
Was this your dad's violin? Mm-hmm.
All we know is that poor Yi's dad is pushing up daisies, a tragedy that shook her world to its core. The most brutal aspect of this one is that he never got to travel the world with his daughter, which, although it's sad, doesn't indicate that his death was anything other than natural, just earlier than it ought to have been. But sometimes you just gotta live and let die. Take it from King Harold from Shrek the Third.
Well, somebody better be dying.
Ooh, Shrek buddy, not the greatest timing there.
I'm dying.
It's unknown what illness finally took the life of Fiona's amphibious old man, but it was brutal enough for him to be coughing up his lungs on his deathbed. And given the fact that he passed out and regained consciousness at least one time during this whole exchange, I'm gonna place my bet on the idea that this was not a pleasant way to go. Still, it was relatively peaceful as far as deaths go, and Harold wasn't exactly young either, so he definitely lived a full life and let die a full life. Tragically, the same can't be said for Ramses' son. He does have a name, but yeah, I don't want want to butcher that. Okay, I'll try. Amunher Kepashef? That sounds right. With the power of God on his side, Moses spends most of the movie desperately trying to get Ramses, his adoptive brother, to see the error of his ways and let his people go. Unfortunately, even after 9 separate plagues throughout the land, the pharaoh would refuse to listen to reason, which led to the 10th and most brutal plague, the deaths of all firstborn sons of Egypt, including Amun, the light of Ramses' life, and a boy who, despite his father's evil, was genuinely beloved to him. It's a heartbreaking scene to watch, and while he passes peacefully, the fact that it took an innocent child's death to move his father to free the Hebrew slaves is easily the most brutal aspect of the movie. Now, these next few won't hit quite that same note of tragedy, but these quick and relatively painless deaths still pack a punch, even if it's just one punch. First up, we have Humpty A. Dumpty, the former friend and partner in crime of Puss in Boots. Humpty did not have the best track record, to say the least. He betrayed Puss multiple times, constantly endangered the people around him, and only decided to turn himself around at the very end of his life. That said, it's better late than never. When it comes to time for Puss to choose between pulling Humpty or the golden gosling up, Humpty simplifies the choice by allowing himself a great, peaceful fall, revealing himself to have a heart of gold, or an egg of gold. It may be a sort of sad, mostly unintentionally funny demise, but Humpty went out on his own terms and saved his soul in the process. Next, we have to give a quick mention to the Egyptian slave driver from The Prince of Egypt. Now, I don't know what possessed this man to accept top-tier work from an elderly worker who isn't being paid for his work, and to reiterate, is elderly, but I do know what possessed Moses, pure, unfiltered rage, and as he rushed to stand up for the old man against that corrupt Egyptian, he ended up inadvertently pushing him off a ledge, sending him plummeting to his doom, and forcing Moses to flee as a result. The slave driver did seem to die instantly, so it wasn't a painful death, and considering the whole slave owner aspect of his character, he definitely got a nicer fate than he deserved with that in mind. In a slightly more sympathetic light, next we have Rock, the icy bird from Sinbad, Legend of the Seven Seas. One of many foes Sinbad faces on his journey to retrieve the lost Book of Peace, Rock here is a gigantic bird who lives on an icy mountain. Unfortunately for Rock, Sinbad was able to use its environment to his own advantage, and by luring it right underneath a huge pile of boulders, well, he's able to cause an avalanche with some crushing effects. From one crushing defeat to another, next up is Frankie from Shark Tale. When this mob boss shark is crushed by an anchor during his pursuit of Oscar, the latter is able to hype himself up as a shark-slaying hero of the sea. We place his death below Rock's because, despite him being a shark, Frankie had more humanity.
I'm so cold.
That's just because we're cold-blooded.
As vicious as he was a shark operating the only way he really knew how to, and while having his skull crushed would have led to a pretty quick death, it still wasn't necessarily what he deserved. Everybody knows that the bird is the word, and in case of this bird from Shrek, that word is pop. Yeah, honestly, this one doesn't need much explanation. That said, it does get some bonus brutality points for the fact that after this bird dies, Fiona proceeds to cook its unborn children for breakfast. That's just messed up, girl, even if delicious. But if we're gonna talk about explosions with multiple casualties, we can't leave Tai Lung's guards out of the discussion. During his epic escape sequence, we get a sense of just how ruthless and terrifying Tai Lung is. For his farewell party, Tai Lung is nice enough to give the gang a fireworks show. Unfortunately, by total and complete accident. The fireworks in question were this weird brand called Dynamite? Yeah, crazy, right? Anyway, Tai Lung killed hundreds of people in that explosion who were just doing their job to keep him away from the Valley of Peace. How he became so much more chill by the fourth movie, it's beyond me. I guess dying helps. But since we mentioned fireworks, let's talk about Master Thundering Rhino from the sequel. Sure, this is just one guy compared to hundreds who passed during Tai Lung's show of power, but that's the thing. Tai Lung didn't directly murder the prison guards per se, they just happened to be casualties of his great escape. Lord Shen, on the other hand, was ready to share his mighty firework cannon with the world. Master Thundering Rhino was ready to fight mano a mano, but Shen isn't exactly the manly type, and as a result, he decided to make Master Thundering Rhino the test subject for his great new weapon. And on the bright side, the test was very successful. On the downside, rip Thundering Rhino. Glad they didn't send one of the Furious Five to stop him at that point, right? Speaking of major characters, it's high time we get back to tragic stuff. Up next is Stoic the Vast from How to Train Your Dragon 2. Stoic is one of the best written characters DreamWorks has ever put out, which is why his end in the second movie was particularly tough to stomach. After finally reconciling with his son and even reuniting with his wife, who he thought was long dead and gone, Stoic met his end at the hands, or breath rather, of a mind-controlled Toothless. Under the control of Drago's Bewilderbeast, Toothless followed his temporary master's bidding and prepared to kill Hiccup with an energy beam at point-blank range, but Stoic at the very last second died the most honorable death a dad could die. He sacrificed his life to save his son. Like Thundering Rhino, Stoic stoic got hit with the full force of an explosion, and although he chose to do so, he got even closer than Rhino did. That's not to mention the fact that he was killed accidentally by his son's pet and greatest ally, jeopardizing their friendship for a time. It's just brutal stuff, man. Rounding out this category, we have the latest in DreamWorks' character deaths, Longneck from The Wild Robot. As the only goose who was even remotely interested in giving poor Bright Bill a chance, Longneck earned the respect of both Roz and the audience right away, and when it came time for them to migrate, he'd take Bright Bill under his wing as part of his formation.
Been ages since I had a youngster in my formation. What do you say?
I promise I'll keep up.
Unfortunately, they'd end up on the wrong end of some Rozums who identified them as intruders, leading to Bright Bill taking charge and bringing the formation to safety, while Longneck distracted them and took the brunt of their fire. While it's entirely possible, and likely honestly, that Longneck died instantly, he didn't die without having to distract the Rozums and confuse their aim for several minutes, and even then, if one hit wasn't enough to finish the job, it could have been a more prolonged death. Regardless, we don't see it on screen, so we'll just conclude that Longneck died as he lived, a hero and an absolute giga-chad of a goose. But whether they died as heroes, villains, or somewhere in between, those in this next category suffered some painful demises. Although they're only secondary antagonists, you could argue that the Toad's henchrats kind of earned their demises. I mean, they are working with a guy who's plotting a legitimate genocide against rodent kind after all, so you could argue these class traitors earned themselves a pretty brutal fate, as mean as that sounds.
Oh, hi boss.
While they died in various different ways, none of them were pretty. From falling off of icy ramps to being frozen in liquid nitrogen to just straight up drowning in sewer water, flushed away, if you will. They met their maker in some pretty dark ways. But if you're afraid of the dark, worry not. The shark from Madagascar 2's fate was anything but dark. In fact, it was quite bright. He died in a literal blaze of glory when he made the mistake of chasing down Mort, a demon of unparalleled strength and malice. Mort had the mercy to not smite the shark right away, but not the mercy to spare him entirely, luring him as a sacrifice into the local volcano. It was flashy, sure, but it was pretty instantaneous, which is good for the shark at least. That said, I'm not sure how pleasant it was for him to be chasing Mort on land for what I can only assume was several miles at least. From a shark's death to a death at the jaws of several sharks, Ariel from Shrek 2 is next. DreamWorks movies, specifically the Shrek saga, are no stranger to poking fun at Disney and other classic fairy tales. I mean, it's like the whole theme of the movie's humor. In the opening scene to Shrek 2, we see Shrek and Fiona enjoying their honeymoon. We also see the Little Mermaid herself enjoying the honeymoon as she somehow swaps places with Fiona, garnering the wrath of the ogres and turning herself into shark food as a result. That's a bit of an extreme reaction, maybe, but in Fiona's defense, all she did was toss her back into the ocean. Karma did the rest. Next up, we have a very minor antagonist, the Boss Wolf from Kung Fu Panda 2. It might seem odd that Shen's second in command doesn't even have a proper name, but that actually reflects the way his boss thinks of him pretty darn accurately.
We're loading ships now.
No! In the final act of the film, Shen orders him to light the cannon, and when the wolf points out that the explosion would kill some of his pack, Shen has absolutely zero concern, proving that he never actually cared about his men, only what they could do for him. Tragically, the one good deed the Boss Wolf does throughout the movie, that being to stand up for himself and his pack, was met with hostility as Shen shanked him without a second thought. It was a death that couldn't have been avoided unless the guy was pure evil, and that's pretty sad when you think about it. Next we have easily the biggest entry on the list, Galaxar's entire planet. Galaxar might just be the most comically maniacal villain in DreamWorks history for no reason but a sad childhood and a crummy marriage. He decides the logical course of action then is to destroy his whole planet and species.
I'm sorry your planet was destroyed.
Oh, don't be. I'm the one who destroyed it.
While an instantaneous explosion like this could have fit in the previous category, this is the death of an entire planet. Like a full-on genocide, or a planet-side. I don't even know if that's a word. This dude is the type of killer who makes you pull out a dictionary. That's the kind of brutality we're talking about here, people. Next we have an umbrella entry for Dulox's Knights from Shrek. These guys refused Shrek's generous offer to settle their differences over a pint, rather than jumping straight to murder. They Shrek'd around, and they would therefore find out the hard way that this ogre and his noble steed were not a duo to be trifled with. From being tossed around like rag dolls, rolled over by gigantic barrels, and straight up crushed in WWE-style rings, these knights got styled on in such brutal ways that Farquaad couldn't help but blast some music in the background. Sometimes leaders have to make noble, totally not inhumane sacrifices to do their work, a lesson that Zeko Khan's acolyte would also be learning by experience. Always pick your line of work carefully, kids. If you don't, you might just end up screwed. Take this poor acolyte, for instance. Jekyll Khan is right on the cusp of finishing the elixir, but he just needs a little more life thrown into it. So without a second thought, he decides to give his acolyte one final job, and that job is simply being an ingredient. Being betrayed like that had to have been pretty brutal, and who knows how painful it is to be part of an elixir. Like, are you liquefied? Do you just fade out of existence? It's one of those deaths that's less outwardly gruesome and more disturbing on account of how much it leaves to the imagination. The same can be said for the tragic death of Po's mother from Kung Fu Panda 2. Despite being a sequel to the funny Panda Kung Fu movie, Kung Fu Panda 2 is easily one of the darkest movies DreamWorks has ever put out. It deals with Po confronting the trauma of his past, which just so happens to concern him being one of the few survivors of a panda genocide led by Lord Shen. We see his mother hide her baby, from said baby's perspective, from the soldiers, fleeing right afterwards. While thankfully the movie was kind enough to spare us the details, we know from the third movie's confirmation that his mother tragically died in that escape attempt. While she at least succeeded in protecting her baby boy, who would go on to protect countless others as the Dragon Warrior, there's little doubt that her demise was a cruel one, especially given how ruthless and callous Lord Shen was. Closing out our penultimate tier, we have Guy's parents from The Croods. We only ever see them via a flashback, but it's known that they died while sinking in a pit of tar. If that one SpongeBob episode taught me anything, it's that sinking in a pit of tar is a slow process. One where the only bright side is that it gives you just enough time to use your final words as a means of encouraging your son to never give up on himself or his dreams. Drowning is a cruel enough fate, but to drown in something other than water, it sounds downright unpleasant. Well, like dying in general sounds pretty unpleasant, but if I just had to choose a method, this one would definitely be near the bottom of my list. Speaking of near the bottom of my list, we're finally here. 6 more deaths remain for today's discussion, and these final few are downright disturbing deaths. Being a cookie in a world of people who eat cookies can't be easy. Take it from alternate timeline Gingy, for instance. Shrek's contract with Rumpelstiltskin resulted in a whole lot of changes to his own life and to those of his friends. Gingy, for example, went from a wisecracking cookie to a ruthless animal cracker crushing gladiator. He plays a pretty minor role, but in the movie's final act, he gets a chance to shine by offering Shrek some invaluable info on Rumple. Finally, some spotlight. And did Puss just actually eat Gingy? No, like, I need you to process this with me. We've actually just watched one iconic Shrek character straight up consume another without a second thought. Yeah, Gingy is alive and well when the timeline gets restored to normal, but still, that's some seriously wild stuff for a kid's movie. It really makes you think to yourself, what a wonderful world, eh? Take it from this little duck from Madagascar. In a final gambit to protect his friends from his predatory instincts, Alex makes the difficult choice to live life as a predator in Madagascar. It's a wake-up call to his friends who realize that outside of the zoo, the circle of life can actually be pretty darn cruel. In one particularly tragic moment, the now trio tries to save a baby duck from the ruthless jungle by taking the little darling over to a peaceful stream. Aw, look at that, he's so cute, and oh yeah, there was an alligator in there. Alright, rest in peace, baby duck from Madagascar. You're the one who truly made DreamWorks what it is today. It's one thing to be eaten by a predator, but to be eaten by your own kind has to be even crueler. Just outside of the top 3, we have to talk about the sushi shop menu from Shark Tale. If you watched Shark Tale and wondered why the sushi shop towards the beginning of the movie has literally no business, well, do me a favor. Google what sushi is and then come back to me. You done yet? Good. So, yeah, I have no idea why this guy's allowed to run a business where he sells the flesh of his own kind as food. Like, has nobody called the cops on this guy? At least they aren't eaten on screen, though, even if they sure are ready for it. The bronze medal of brutality goes to the Gronkle from How to Train Your Dragon. This guy's death is the revelation of why dragons are seemingly so hostile to Vikings, and really all other living creatures in general. They aren't taking sacrifices to be cruel or greedy or anything. Rather, they're taking them as sacrifices to the Red Death, the biggest and scariest dragon of the bunch. What happens if they don't bring food, you ask? Well, don't worry about that. They always bring food. For example, this Gronkle only offered one measly fish to his boss. No problem, though. He's got wings, bones, arms, legs, eyes, a whole buffet right there in front of her. Bon appetit, Red Death. The silver medal of brutality goes to the steak raiser of Chicken Run, Edwina. A chicken farm has to make a profit, so if a chicken stops laying eggs, there's only one logical thing to do. Chop it up and make it into a nice, reasonably priced meal. Whether you're a vegan or a meat lover of the highest caliber, you can't deny that the way Mrs. Tweety runs her farm is pretty cruel. The chickens live in constant fear of her, knowing that if they don't meet their quota, they'll be in for certain death. Sure, the death itself is a simple beheading. In other words, it's more or less instantaneous, but it's worth noting that chickens usually survive a few seconds after losing their heads. In 1945, there was a case where one lived for 18 months without it. Thankfully, this wasn't the case for Edwina, but the sheer terror she experienced slowly being carried to the cutting table is enough to call this one of the most brutal deaths in DreamWorks history. But in an absolute landslide, the most brutal fate in DreamWorks history has to be that of Mongo from Shrek 2. Gingy's connection to the Muffin Man proves to be invaluable in the final battle.
Fire up the ovens, Muffin Man! We've got a big order to fill!
When it comes time to storm the castle, the gang gets him to bake Gingy a gigantic sun to carry them there. He takes hits from fireballs and all sorts of weapons, but tragically, the soldiers proved themselves ready for anything with the cookie's greatest nemesis, milk. After being doused with milk twice, not to mention losing one of his gumdrop buttons, Mongo falls to his end in the castle's moat. What makes this one the most brutal, aside from the fact that Mongo is basically a gigantic cookie slash baby, is the fact that he's dying in water. Make a mental note of what liquid does to a cookie. The crumbs slowly break off, sometimes whole chunks will separate and fall to the bottom of the cup, etc. In other words, Mongo is being slowly ripped apart piece by piece underwater, and before you say he's gonna drown before it gets too painful, in the iconic Livin' La Vida Loca cover by Puss and a Donkey, Mongo is still conscious enough to join in for a line. He's somehow dying with a smile on his face, which at least indicates that he's not feeling pain. But from our point of view, the dude is being slowly, very slowly disintegrated crumb by crumb, and the dude has a lot of crumbs. You're a true hero, Mongo. Here's to enjoying all of the gumdrop buttons you can carry in heaven.
With Dreamworks The Bad Guys 2 in the works,
Where's my flowers? Prego, cappuccino.
It's time to take a close look at the original film about furry criminals to see where they stack up on the morality spectrum. This is Dreamworks The Bad Guys Good to Evil. And as always, we're going to be starting with our most morally upstanding and heroic characters before working our way down to the most wicked. These characters are the good, or perhaps we should just say character, since only one character managed to make it into this tier, that being the governor, Diane Foxington, aka the Crimson Paw. Although formerly an infamous thief, Diane proves herself to be a shining example of a so-called bad guy being able to change their ways. Unfortunately, even Diane has her doubts about the bad guys at first, despite her own past, leading to her acting pretty frosty towards them and their so-called reformation.
Burglary, mayhem, assault with a deadly reptile?
That said, when Mr. Wolf shows that he genuinely wants to change, she starts becoming nicer towards him and ends up becoming his biggest supporter in his redemption. She also saves all of the bad guys while they're in prison and assists in saving the day, and was even willing to sacrifice her new life just so the bad guys wouldn't have to go to jail. When it comes to her own past, we have to admire her for choosing to help others without any prompting from anyone else. That all being said, Diane is not perfect. She can still be a bit snarky and insulting at times, and even kept one of the diamonds she stole as the Crimson Paw, seeing it as a sentimental item. Still, she manages to stand out as the most good character in this film, if only because the rest of the cast isn't quite so moral. Which brings us to our biggest section in this video, the gray area, featuring characters who may be seen as bad but really aren't that bad. And first up is arguably the main character of the film, Mr. Wolf. Wolf is the team leader of his gang, being both the plan guy as well as an expert pickpocketer. But while he may claim to be the big bad wolf, he's actually the first of the bad guys to go good. Sure, he originally saw their redemption as a cover story for another robbery, which, you know, isn't great. But once he starts getting a taste of what being good is like, this eventually leads to him failing to finish their heist at the Gaia, being unable to betray the newfound trust and respect he now had. Wolf even tells Diane where she can find the bad guy's hideout and stolen loot, though admittedly he did this without the other bad guy's knowledge, leading to it feeling like a total betrayal from their perspective. When it comes to his species, Wolf can be a mix of both good and bad stereotypes. Naturally, as a thief, he can be snarky and often tries to use his charm to his advantage. He can also be violent, such as in the moment where he learns the truth about Marmalade. However, Wolf can also be brave, determined, protective, and loyal, especially to his friends, even Snake, who he never gave up on, always believing that he could be good even after their falling out. He also saved Snake's life in the film's climax. All in all, he is someone who genuinely wants to be good despite all of his faults. With that said, we do have to award him several Sinner medals. We're giving Wolf the Greed Sinner medal. While he eventually grows past this, he has some pretty sticky fingers, as we constantly see him swiping jewelry and wallets. And he also puts his team in danger at the beginning of the film because he wanted a longer car chase. We're also awarding him the Envy Sinner medal. While it was implied that all of the bad guys wished to not be seen as monsters, Wolf was the one who desired it the most, even to the point of being subtly jealous about Diane's approval from the public. Moving on to Police Chief Misty Luggins. Being the chief of police, her main goal throughout the film is to put the bad guys away for good.
Keep running, Wolf! One of these days
days your luck is gonna run out!
She has quite a bit of temper and can even be seen as a bit crazy at times, being willing to take comically huge risks to catch them. She definitely earns the Wrath Medal. Throughout the film, her only goal is to capture the bad guys, with her anger and hatred of them being pretty palpable. She hates the bad guys so much that even when they're framed for theft, she arrests them outright without giving them a chance to defend themselves, and is absolutely thrilled that she can finally throw them in jail. So yeah, she definitely serves as an antagonist, hence why we can't place her in the good tier even if she's technically a quote good guy. But we will acknowledge that she's a dedicated officer who's just trying to enforce the law, trying her best to stop crime. We suppose we can't really blame her for being so over the top about it. And additionally, she does arrest Marmalade at the end of the film, so we'll give her a couple bonus points for that. Next up is the 8-legged hacker, Miss Tarantula. She's an expert hacker, able to outsmart pretty much any security measure, even security systems that are specifically designed to counter her.
Boys, it's dolphin season.
Sometimes her hacking can cause more than a little damage, especially when she's messing with traffic lights, but you can't say her skills aren't useful. In fact, she's an incredibly strong member of the team, despite her tiny size. As for her morality and personality, though she can sometimes have a bit of a sharp tongue, often being more than a little snarky whenever she teases the rest of the gang, she's still also pretty chill. We even see her become quick friends with Diane, the two of them being two of the most focused members in the group, and it's kinda sweet to see. We also see Miss Tarantula take the time to order Mr. Snake a cake for his birthday, and even if he doesn't like his birthday, it was still a very sweet gesture. Next is the Master of Disguise, Mr. Shark. Given that he's an actor that tends to go over the top with his distractions and performances,
It's me! I was the construction worker!
it shouldn't be a surprise that Mr. Shark is usually the most emotional of the group. That's not to say he can't still be on his A game, as we see him help out when the gang gets in a jam during the film's first Golden Dolphin heist. Though usually a gentle giant, he does have his limitations, like when Snake refuses to share his push pop, leading to Shark actually eating Snake, which is definitely one way to get some petty revenge. Outside of these moments though, Shark is probably right up there with Wolf when it comes to being one of the more nice members of the gang, even if he can sometimes be fairly destructive too. From the distraction to the muscle, we have Mr. Piranha up next. Don't let his size fool you, Mr. Piranha more than earns the title of the muscle, thanks to his anger and eagerness to not just fight, but also his love of beating people up in general. In fact, he's seen as the most unhinged and actively violent member of the gang. Though maybe that's not too surprising, given that he's a piranha and all. Violent tendencies and anger issues aside, Mr. Piranha does have his moments of being more than just a brawler. He's adorable at times, either when he's being a bit more cheerful, or even in some of his more anxious moments. And much like the rest of the bad guys, he also cares deeply about the rest of the gang, and that counts for something. Now, nearing the end of this section, we have the sarcastic Mr. Snake. Being the safecracker, second in command and literal snake of the team, Mr. Snake is probably the closest to being an actual bad guy. While the other bad guys can be very nice for a group of criminals, Mr. Snake often comes off as a bit of a jerk.
Sucker.
He's also extremely cynical and is often seen arguing with Wolf that all of them are beyond redemption. When it comes to their goodness exercises, Snake is the one who's barely trying, whether it's refusing to share or eating all the guinea pigs that they were supposed to save. Unsurprisingly, he earns the Gluttony Sinner Medal. I mean, the guy literally eats hundreds of guinea pigs, unable to stop himself from chowing down once he sees them. Still, Snake does genuinely care about his friends, even if he doesn't always show it, like when he finally shares a push pop with Mr. Shark, just to try and cheer him up. This is also seen through the film's big twist. After he eventually decides to ditch the gang, Snake uses this as an opportunity to team up with Marmalade. However, this partnership is revealed to be a huge lie, with Snake using his new partnership to try and sabotage Marmalade's scheme from within. This is ultimately what keeps Snake from the bad tier, even if he can still sometimes be the worst. And finishing off our gray area is the movie's news reporter, Tiffany Fluffit. Though a fairly minor character within the film, she does tend to cause just a bit of trouble for the bad guys through her less than stellar reporting, given that she tends to pop up whenever major events are happening. Nearly all of her reporting on the bad guys is slanted against them, making it even harder for them to be redeemed in the public eye.
And all stereotypes have been affirmed.
Even when she begins to praise their efforts, it doesn't take much for Tiffany to begin bad-mouthing them again. That said, when Marmalade is revealed to have the Zumpango diamond, Tiffany immediately turns on him, accusing him of being the Crimson Paw, broadcasting his ruined reputation to the entire city. So that is a positive. Though to be fair, this could be less about wanting to help bring Marmalade to justice, and more about being the one to report on a huge scoop. Either way, while she may not be outright malicious, Tiffany's attitude could potentially make her seem callous. And finally, we've arrived at our bad and evil section, where we only have one single character. But first, this video is brought to you by Wicked Binge channel memberships. You can gain access to our videos early before anyone else, plus get members-only emojis and loyalty badges by supporting the channel through a membership. Taking the bronze medal of evil by default is Professor Rupert Marmalade IV. Though originally seen as a kind-hearted philanthropist, Marmalade had planned on using the bad guys for his own means by the very beginning, and admits to not caring about anyone but himself. Marmalade can be extremely pompous and extremely smug, seeing himself as more clever than anyone else. We feel that Marmalade definitely earns the Pride Sinner Medal.
Look no further. Your hero has arrived.
Not only is he extremely prideful when it comes to his status, but he's also incredibly self-absorbed. This in turn leads to him also being manipulative, seeing the bad guys as a means to an end and having absolutely no regrets about betraying them, making him even worse than any of the bad guys in that Marmalade is willing to cross lines that the gang never would, like stealing from charity and attempting to murder people. This being seen when he kicks Snake out of his helicopter, or when he tries to kill Wolf and Diane. To sum it up, Marmalade is a villain through and through, having absolutely no good side to him whatsoever, which easily earns him the gold medal for most evil character in the bad guys. Dreamworks Animation's The Wild Robot may be brand new, but I'm pretty confident it's one of the best of DreamWorks' entire lineup. We're talking Shrek 2 levels of quality here, folks. And with a cast full of pretentious beavers, copyright-infringing falcons, and friendly robot serfs, there's plenty of goodness to go around. So we ranked all the Wild Robot characters from good to most good.
You do not belong here. This is a wilderness.
And I am a wild robot.
So today we'll be starting off with the least good. Characters who are good, but selfish. And we kick the list off with the closest this movie has to a kinda, sorta villain. Vantra is up first. As the main antagonist of the movie, it makes sense that she's in the lowest spot on our list. Granted, we can't exactly call her evil since she's more of a morally neutral character. Like, she literally calls herself one. Not a lot of wiggle room there. Still, discredit where it's due, for a morally neutral character, Vantra really toes the line. While she's a robot created to serve her company wholeheartedly, sort of akin to Otto from WALL-E, she's also disturbingly ruthless in pursuit of her goals. Most notably, when she's trying to detain Roz, she sends out other robots to attack her and the forest animals.
Are those your parents?
And when they're defeated, uses their corpses as bombs that end up causing a pretty devastating forest fire. Complete disregard for natural life and the environment as a whole earns her the lowest spot on our list, but again, she is just doing what she's programmed to do. Something tells me there's something much more sinister behind all that programming, but let's save that discussion for the sequel this movie is gonna get eventually, hopefully. Next, we have the first organic life forms on our list, the other geese. Man, poor Bright Bill. You spend the first act of the movie rooting for him to learn how to swim so he can connect with the rest of his species, only for them to immediately turn on him for no reason other than him being raised by the monster, who literally never did anything to them.
You know, suddenly I'm thinking I should maybe just stay with you guys this winter.
Nope. Their meaningless bias earns them the Wrath Sinner Medal, and their second to last place spot is earned by their sheer insensitivity. Like, even if Roz was a monster, why is that a reason to hate on Bright Bill for being raised by her? To make matters worse, these birds know that Roz killed Bright Bill's family, albeit accidentally, so their response is to bully him for it. I really wish I could just put these guys in the bad category, but they do eventually warm up to Bright Bill and even help the rest of the forest animals protect their home from universal dynamics. You know, after Bright Bill saves all their butts. And closing out the lower category of do-gooders, we have the raccoons. True to the stereotype, these little bandits earn themselves the greed sinner medal. They see something shiny and remotely interesting, they want it, and they'll take it. Even if it means harassing Roz to take some of her appendages for what seems like nothing but sheer fun. Like the geese, they're mainly motivated by selfishness and fear, which at least isn't as bad as them wanting to cause anybody harm. And also like them, they ultimately come around to help protect the forest when they're needed. Which brings us to our middle category, which is made up of flawed but heroic characters. And sneaking into this category against all odds is Fink, Roz's BFF, best fox friend. Of course, that's not to say things were smooth sailing for these two right from the get-go. Fink makes a pretty poor first impression by attempting to steal Brightbill's unhatched egg from Roz. He then doubles down on that crummy reputation by calling himself a gooseling expert and offering his services to help find food for the little guy.
Easy, I can teach him the way my mom taught me.
Unfortunately, his expertly crafted approaches largely fail, but he's kind enough to eat all that excess gooseling food for himself. Which is actually pretty darn generous of him, especially for a fox. And wait a second, gluttony sinner medal. That's not an easy track record to bounce back from, but Fink is actually a pretty decent guy. Most of his worst attributes are due to his rough upbringing and lack of friends. Once he becomes friends with Roz, he slowly becomes a better person, ultimately helping to save the rest of the forest critters from a freezing storm and rallying them together to unite to protect each other in their home. The power of friendship really does change people for the better, especially if you're a fox in a Dreamworks movie, apparently. Oh damn. No, really, nice damn, Paddler. Paddler is another character who turns out to be a much nicer of a guy than he's given credit for, similar to Fink.
Do everyone a favor and expire downstream.
Even if, unlike Fink, his most prominent sin is pride, for which we'll be giving him the Pride Sinner Medal. This is one beaver who takes a lot of pride in his dam work, and his other projects too, like trying day after day to gnaw the biggest tree in the forest down to the point of timber. The other animals make fun of him for this constantly, but he stays determined, which I guess you could paint as a good or bad trait. You might assume him to be a stuck-up shut-in at first, and he at least kinda is that, but he's also compassionate. When Roz breaks his leg helping Brightbill learn how to fly, he makes her a new one out of wood. He's also willing to help the other animals knock down the giant tree as a means of helping put out the aforementioned forest fire, albeit only after some apologies from the others for insulting him all those years. After the fact, he's even kind enough to make hand-whittled sculptures of himself and his friends. I mean, sure, he makes himself the biggest one, but that's the privilege of being an artist. For our next entry, we choose the bear, even if we wouldn't have in the first act of the movie. The bear is, well, he's a bear. A bear voiced by Mark Hamill, but a bear nonetheless. And that leads to him being aggressive towards any meager creature who comes his way.
I know predators, and those are predators.
Despite being the biggest and strongest critter in the forest, though, the bear isn't a bad guy. When it comes down to it, he uses his strength for good. From being the first to agree to a truce with the other animals during the snowstorm, to being the first to reassure Fink that he'll still have friends once Roz is gone. Of course, it is worth noting that he has hunted plenty of prey in the past, and while animals having survival instincts is far from unreasonable, we still can't call him as pure as some of the other characters. Nearing the top of this category, we have Pinktail, the mother of 7, almost 6 briefly, baby possums. Right off the bat, Pinktail's mothering skills earns her a lot of points. When Roz tries to pawn Brightbill off on her, it's Pinktail who returns him safe and sound to his unofficial mother. She even indirectly gives her a task to raise him, ensuring the little guy won't be abandoned.
Taking care of him is your task now.
Acquired.
Given how much she undoubtedly has to deal with on a day-to-day basis, the fact that her heart still has room to care for other people's kids alongside her own says a lot about how great she is. Of course, there's also the fact that she expressed slight disappointment upon seeing that one of her 7 children didn't just straight up die.
It's okay, Mom. I'm alive.
Like, I get that motherhood is exhausting, but being relieved by your kid's death is pretty screwed up. Despite that, she seems to have a good heart, but she may just need a babysitter. But let's round out this category with the otters. While they don't do much remarkable throughout the film, aside from the baby otter getting the other animals' attention for Fink's pro-Roz speech, they're notable for being the first animals Roz sees when she wakes up, while the majority of the forest population immediately ostracizes and or attacks her. These little otters are pretty chummy with her, until she suddenly wakes up, startling them in the process. And I mean, come on, just look at these little guys. The penguins have officially received their rivals in terms of cute and cuddly. And this brings us to our final category. It's time to discuss our top 5, where we have the pure good characters. At number 5, it's finally time to talk about that iconic android with a heart of gold and a home of grass. That's right, it's time to talk about Rummage. What? Who do you think I meant? Don't tell me you forgot about Rummage, the character who was so determined to give us a taste of that sweet, sweet world building that she was revived from robot death just to do it. Not just that, upon waking up, she offers Roz an ear to listen to her woes, and upon realizing that she's defective, aka able to experience emotions, straight up gives her a part of her body so she can be taken back to where she belongs. I mean, sure, when you say it like that, it sounds kind of messed up, but still, as far as emotionless robots go, Rummage was an MVP in her own right. I hope she's enjoying her rest. When Roz needed someone to help Bright Bill learn how to fly, she used Thunderbolts, and it was super effective. I mean, granted, this guy had way less screen time than I would have expected, but from what we see of him, this mighty falcon helped the infamously unpopular Bright Bill learn how to fly so he wouldn't miss out on migration. He even helps him to feel more confident about his short wings, showing that he's both an altruist and a body positivity guru. All of that is on top of Thunderbolt apparently asking for nothing in return for training Bright Bill. That is, except for not being sued by Pikachu. I can only imagine the legal battle that would ensue if Thunderbolts were a mouse. But I digress. Let's soar into our podium of good, starting with the bronze medalist, Bright Bill. Bright Bill is an adorable runt of a gooseling taken in by Roz as a baby. Or I guess as a fetus in an egg, if you want to be technical. My point is, Bright Bill imprinted on Roz right away, and spends most of the movie following the innocent, naive kid archetype to a T. Of course, this can get him into a fair bit of trouble, most notably when he accidentally gets the Rosm units to attack his fellow geese after mistaking one of them for his adoptive mom. But that does nothing to take away from his good traits. In the same scene, for instance, he ends up using his just learned flight skills, along with his lack of fear of the Rosms, to lead the other geese to safety. There's also the tiny detail that despite Roz accidentally killing his whole family before he was born, Bright Bill forgave her way quicker than most people would, which I'd say is pretty darn admirable. And speaking of which, my next task is to tell you who gets the Silver Medal of Good, and that's none other than Rosm 7134. But you can just call her Roz, of course. Despite initially being an emotionless robot, Roz adopts a baby gooseling and slowly has to override her own programming to deal with the crushing obligation/blessing that is motherhood.
How would you rate my performance?
On top of being literally factory made to help others however she can, and being prevented from causing any harm to them, Roz prioritizes helping her friends above all else. During a snowstorm, she rescues all of her animal friends with the help of Fink, ensuring everyone is safe and warm in her shelter, and nearly dying in the process. That's a common pattern with Roz, actually. She constantly risks her neck to help others, particularly Bright Bill, who she's fully ready to die for on at least 2 different occasions throughout the movie. In the end, she makes the tough decision to allow Universal Dynamics to take her prisoner, so that the forest animals will never have to see their home burnt and destroyed in pursuit of her again. It's a bittersweet ending, but above all else, it shows that Roz is always going to place others' well-being far, far above her own, and that is truly the essence of a hero. But while a case could be made that Roz is one of the most heroic protagonists in DreamWorks history, this movie has one character we consider even more noble. The Gold Medal of Good has to go to Longneck. In his very first appearance, Longneck earned a lot of good points right off the bat. When he meets Roz, he compliments her boy's flight skills, showing that he's on good terms with both Roz and Bright Bill, and the only goose who tries to be civil with either of them. But what really makes him a top tier pick is the way he goes out. Remember the plan I mentioned earlier where Brightbill led the other geese away from the Rosms to safety? Yeah, the thing is, those robots were firing a lot of lasers, and as such, the geese needed a shield. That shield just so happened to be the very same tall old British goose who came up with the idea in the first place. Even down to the little detail of him getting killed in the crossfire to buy his young trainee some time. Longneck was willing to sacrifice his own life for the good of his whole species, so they could escape and have a better life. Not to mention where they were all unified under the very same bird they used to look down on. Longneck will be missed, but we're giving him the gold medal of good fitting for such a long, noble spinal cord. It's time to let the awesomeness begin. Because Kung Fu Panda is back in theaters, baby. With the latest installment, it's once again time to use our morality scale to break down the good, the bad, and the furry? I'm Kyle with Wicked Binge, and this is Kung Fu Panda 4 characters, good to evil. As usual, let's start with our best, brightest, and most heroic, and kick things off with the good section. Without a doubt, our gold medal of good has to go to the Kung Fu Panda himself, Po. Even after 4 films and a handful of side stories, Po still remains his lovable and heroic self, protecting others and doing what he can to save the world.
Attention, mysterious figure! The Dragon Warrior's here to perform justice!
This time around, Po has to deal with letting go of his Dragon Warrior title in order to fully become the Valley's next spiritual leader. For this, we have to give him the Pride Medal, as while Po may not be extremely egotistical, him putting so much stock in his Dragon Master title is what ends up inadvertently leading to the chameleon nearly winning in the end. While he's reluctant to give up this role, we aren't going to dock him too many points, as once he realizes how badly he messed up by holding onto his role, he immediately takes it upon himself to try and fix things, even if it means potentially getting himself killed. He's also a great influence on his new protege, Zen, being kind to her and eventually giving her the motivation to leave the chameleon and try to be a hero instead of just a tricky thief. He may be a bit silly at times, but the panda's got a stomach full of dumplings and a heart of gold. And moving on to our silver medal of good, we have Po's adopted dad, Mr. Ping. Once again, Mr. Ping is definitely the MVP both in terms of Kung Fu Panda characters and Dreamworks dads in general. While he may be a bit more neurotic in this installment, being extra worried for his son given how powerful people claim the chameleon to be, he's still just as supportive as ever, after Po's staff is stolen, while Ping agrees that, yeah, it's a pretty big screw-up. He also takes the time to comfort Po and tell him how changes don't always have to be a bad or scary thing.
Why do you think I always change the menu at the restaurant?
Sometimes they can be good or simply keep life feeling exciting. With the main example of this that Ping brings up is when he became a father, which is really sweet. Afterwards, while we don't see him or Lee do much of the fighting, they still play a part in assuring that their makeshift army of thieves is able to take down a good chunk of the chameleon's army. Right behind him is Po's other dad and our bronze medal of good winner, Li Shan. While Mr. Ping may wear his nervous nature on his sleeve, Lee at times tries to keep calm, all while trying to keep his new business partner and co-parent calm as well. However, even Lee can't hide his protective dad side forever, and when he and Ping go out to try and find Po, it's often Ping who has to act as the fake muscle in order to keep them both out of danger.
Hold me, Ping!
He can be a bit clumsy about it, but hey, he's trying his best. Still, we unfortunately have to give him the Darwin Medal, since a few of these attempts at being tough and warrior-like are done in a pretty dumb way, like how he ends up giving himself splinters or knocking out a few of his own teeth. And much like Mr. Ping, Lee is still just as much of a loving and supportive dad as he was in the last movie, trying to be there for his son whenever he needs him. Heck, just the fact that he was willing to permanently leave the hidden panda village says a lot about how badly he wants to be in Po's life, without taking his son away from the home he's grown up in and sworn to protect. It's great having protective yet supportive parents, but sometimes we need that not-so-gentle push, and that's where Master Shifu, the final member of the good tier, comes in. Shifu is the one insisting that Po must find a protege and move on to the final step of his training for the sake of the Valley of Peace. While he still obviously respects Po and is just trying to encourage him to do the right thing for both himself and the Valley.
Oogway chose you as his successor, and now you must choose yours.
Shifu is also more than a little pushy and often gets frustrated with Po's reluctance. He also isn't afraid to show his shock and mild disapproval at the end of the film when he learns that Po chose Zen to be the next Dragon Warrior. though despite his mixed emotions at Poe's choice, he ultimately lets it be, once again showing the respect he has for a student, even if he doesn't always understand him. As such, we're sure he'll warm up to Zen eventually too. And that wraps up our good section, which brings us into more neutral territory. These characters fall somewhere in between good and bad. Welcome to the gray area. And starting out this tier is Poe's new protege, Zen. While she may be a bit rough around the edges at the start, we see her try to steal several priceless kung fu artifacts from the Jade Palace.
Oh no! He's got a walking stick. What are you gonna do, stroll me to death?
Later on, we again see her lack of morals during the scene in Granny Boar's cliffside restaurant, where she hustles Granny and several others, and then tries to steal a bunch of coin bags during her and Poe's fight with the restaurant's array of rough customers. But of course, Zen's worst moment is when it's revealed that she had been tricking Poe the whole time, leading him into a position where she could get his staff for the chameleon. We should note, however, that Zen immediately regrets this due to the friendship she and Poe have built up by that point. After she discovers Poe is still alive, she puts her all into trying to stop Poe from facing the chameleon again, not wanting him to be killed, and then chooses to fight by his side during the climax.
You sound surprised. Is it surprising?
Though a tad predictable, it's still a really nice arc to see play out. And you understand that Zen was never a truly bad character. She was just trying to survive and was taught by really bad influences. We can't overlook her crimes, but we are willing to give her a chance and are excited to see how she comes into her own as the Valley of Peace's newest hero in training. Now, we wanted to take a brief moment to talk about the minor but still helpful character of Captain Fish. Captain Fish is, well, a fish. He mostly stays in the mouth of his pelican mom, and though he mostly tries to stay out of trouble, for a steep price he'll offer you a ride to Juniper City on his boat. He does try to charge Poe triple for the ride, but eventually just settles for double, which we suppose is something, I guess. He's pretty surly, much like most sea captains you see in movies, but he still does his job well and gets Poe and Zen to Juniper City without any issue, even if he admittedly isn't the best at docking his boat. Later on, we see him try to tell Mr. Ping and Lee that he has seen Poe, and likely would have offered them a bit of extra information. Too bad they were unable to understand him, but I guess it's the thought that counts. It's always great when you get a full redemption arc, but sometimes even a small showing of respect can go a long way. With that in mind, our surprising next entry is Tai Lung. Okay, yeah, the trailers and posters kinda made it seem like Tai Lung was gonna play a much bigger role in the movie. In reality, we only see him in the movie's climax, and even then, he's stuck in a cage most of the time. Credit to Tai Lung, while we're sure he wouldn't care that much about putting others in danger, he does still refuse to willingly give the chameleon his kung fu skills, forcing her to take it from him. Shortly after, he makes a point of telling Poe that Oogway chose poorly and that Poe really screwed up this time. Still, he thankfully isn't able to discourage Poe too much, so this is more just him being a jerk than him being an active antagonist. But beyond Tai Lung just not doing much in general, what allows him to get a decent spot in the gray tier is the moment after the final fight, where he actually gives Poe his respect. He's even the one to lead the others in the grand bow towards Poe. Additionally, Tai Lung is also the one to keep a hold of the chameleon and drag her to the spirit realm. All in all, he may not be the nicest guy around, but he's definitely no longer as much of a villain, at least not in this instance. Now, keeping with our not-so-bad criminals, up next is Han. He's a pangolin who leads an underground group of thieves and was the one to take Zen in when she was a young fox. Naturally, this made her decision to leave the group behind and work for the chameleon all the more of a betrayal, to the point where Han and his crew want to beat Zen up when she returns to their hideout. Still, the fact that Han is willing to cut Zen some slack and allow her and Poe to stay until the coast is clear shows that he may still have a soft side for her. Then again, each time he chooses to help Poe and Zen, he specifically does so under the guise that if he does good now, he can do something more bad and violent later.
Or slow and painful.
With the rest of his crew having a similar mindset. Still, while he may not have the most pure motivations when it comes to helping out, making it very clear that he's only helping take out the chameleon because it would be beneficial for him and the rest of the thieves, he still plays a major role in the fight against the chameleon's army, and we do feel that that counts for something. Now, just barely keeping out of the bad tier is our final entry in the gray, the bunny triplets. We actually had a hard time deciding whether or not these guys qualified for the bad section. To call them chaotic and completely rabid is practically an understatement. In every scene with these three, they're gleefully hurting others, either through their pranks or through their own sharp teeth and claws. They attack without warning and then laugh about it afterwards, emphasizing how much they see violence and crime as just a fun game. In all honesty, all of this would probably easily earn them a spot in the bad section under different circumstances. Still, these guys are just little kids, so there's an argument to be made that they could eventually grow out of all this. What's more, much like Zen and Han, they also help just enough in the climax of the movie that we're able to cut them just a bit of slack, even if we can't completely overlook their rabidness. Still, maybe someone should get these guys into a school or something. Maybe that one prison/daycare that Poe briefly mentioned, as they could probably use some additional structure as well as some more positive influences. We finally arrived at the true bad guys of the bunch. These characters are the bad and the evil. Taking our silver medal of evil is another minor character, Granny Boar. She's the manager of the Happy Bunny restaurant, and let's just say she's not exactly world's greatest boss material. Not only is she the only antagonist we meet who doesn't come back in the climax to help in the fight against the chameleon, but she's also just a really terrible person in general. She treats her bunny waitstaff terribly, to the point of forcing one to sit in a pot of broth as he stirs it, making it clear that she could very easily turn him into that day's special if he angers her enough. Given how she forces these bunnies to do all the work without giving them proper compensation or even some basic appreciation, we have to give her the sloth medal alongside the silver medal for evil. She also allows her customers to treat her waitstaff poorly, allowing them to throw knives at the bunnies and steal their tips. And when Mr. Ping tries to stand up to her later on, she just threatens to throw him into the broth pot too.
Keep stirring!
Given the name of the restaurant, it could also be speculated that Granny Boar just stole it from the original bunny owners. Looking at all this, it's really no wonder her staff started cheering when she and the restaurant eventually fell off the cliff and into the ocean. Finally, our gold medal of evil has to go to the franchise's latest big bad, the Chameleon. Once seen as too small and not a good fit to learn Kung Fu, the Chameleon uses her sorcery and intelligence in the hopes of eventually gaining enough power to where no one could ever underestimate her again.
Who's that?
The most powerful shape-shifting sorceress, the Chameleon.
In a way, the Chameleon is described as a sort of mirror to Poe in that both characters were underestimated by society for their bodies, but then went on to gain high status. But as Poe says, she had to steal her newfound skills. Furthermore, for all the changing she does on her outside, she still refuses to change on the inside.
I'm the chameleon. I do nothing but change.
Caring so much about vengeance and petty revenge that she doesn't bother trying to find any other path that could potentially make her happy. But even before she starts stealing Kung Fu skills from old villains and masters, the Chameleon is already portrayed as a tyrant with a stranglehold on Juniper City, demanding tribute and keeping citizens and thieves alike from making a decent living. These two majorly evil deeds combined earns her our Greed Medal, as well as our Envy Medal, as her desire to be a Kung Fu master very much comes from her being jealous of those who not only had the skills, but also had the opportunity to train in Kung Fu. We should also mention the relationship with Zen, which very much has those Mother Gothel vibes in that she only ever helped Zen because she saw herself in Zen and, as such, figured she'd be useful to have around. She may have given Zen food and shelter, but she also treated her pretty terribly and later made it clear just how willing she'd be to toss Zen aside if she were to ever stop being the thief she knew Zen to be. For all these reasons, she's easily the most evil character in this fourth installment, though in all honesty, she still can't quite hold a candle to some of the franchise's other villains. But good attempt though.